The chapel doors opened, and for one last second, everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to. My bouquet rested against my waist. My father's hand was warm around mine, and Josh was waiting for me at the altar in the dark suit we'd picked out together months earlier. About 90 people turned in their seats as the music changed. Dad leaned slightly toward me, and I thought he was about to say something sentimental. Instead, he released my arm. I looked at him, confused, but he was already stepping away from me. My sister Kayla stood several feet behind us in the vestibule, where Mom had brought her moments earlier for what she'd called a quick family picture before the ceremony. Kayla wasn't a bridesmaid. She had no place in the procession at all. But Dad crossed the small space between us, stopped in front of her, and offered her his arm. For a second, nobody moved. Then Mom actually clapped. It wasn't loud, just 2 quick, encouraging claps as she smiled at Kayla and said, "Go on, sweetheart." That was the moment my confusion disappeared. Whatever was happening, it wasn't a mistake. Kayla slipped her hand through Dad's arm. My wedding coordinator froze near the doorway with her clipboard against her chest because this wasn't anywhere on the schedule we'd reviewed. Dad turned toward the aisle with my younger sister beside him, and the room went so quiet that I could hear the faint rustle of Kayla's dress as they started forward. I remember staring at the back of my father's suit and thinking there had to be some explanation that wasn't as ugly as the one forming in my head. There wasn't. Dad took one step with Kayla, then another, then a third. Josh didn't move from the altar, but something changed in his face the instant he understood what they were doing. He raised one hand, palm out, and his voice carried through the chapel without him having to shout. One more step, and everyone here hears the truth. If you're listening to this today, I hope your day is going a lot more peacefully than that Saturday in May went for me. Stay with me, because what happened in those first 3 steps only made sense after I learned what my parents had been doing behind my back. And if you enjoy stories about family boundaries finally having consequences, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what came next. To understand why my husband knew exactly what to say at the altar, I have to take you back 3 weeks, to the evening he handed me his phone and said, "Danny, you need to see this." Josh and I were at our condo in Columbus after work. Dinner containers were still sitting on the kitchen counter. My laptop was open beside a stack of wedding confirmations, and I had been complaining about whether we really needed to change the seating chart again because one of my cousins had broken up with his girlfriend. It was the kind of ordinary wedding problem I would have happily traded for what came next. Josh sat across from me, unlocked his phone, and pushed it across the table. I looked at him before I looked at the screen. He wasn't nervous in the way someone looks when they're trying to confess something. He looked tired and irritated, like he had been carrying a problem for exactly as long as it took him to decide it wasn't his problem alone. "Kayla's been messaging me," he said. Some of it was normal at first. It isn't anymore. My first reaction was automatic. "I'll handle Kayla." I said it before I'd even picked up the phone, because that was how I dealt with family problems for most of my adult life. My family, my responsibility, my mess to contain. Josh shook his head. "She's your sister, but she contacted me. This belongs to both of us." He didn't tell me to calm down, and he didn't say he'd hidden the messages because he didn't want to upset me. He simply turned the phone so I could read everything in order. That mattered more to me than I knew how to explain at the time. I started at the top. Months earlier, Kayla had sent him perfectly ordinary messages, the kind I wouldn't have thought twice about if I'd seen them then. She thanked him for helping Dad move a bookcase. She asked which restaurant we'd gone to for my birthday because she wanted to take a friend there. She sent a picture of Mom struggling with a new coffee machine and wrote, "Your future mother-in-law is losing a war with technology." Josh had answered those messages because there had been no reason not to. His replies were brief, friendly, and completely normal. "Tell her to hold the button for 5 seconds. That place is on High Street. New problem." Nothing secretive, nothing flirtatious, nothing I could honestly have called inappropriate. Then the tone changed. It happened gradually enough that I could understand why Josh hadn't recognized it from the first strange sentence. Kayla started talking less about the family and more about him. She told him he was patient with Mom in a way I wasn't. She said he always seemed to know how to calm people down. Then came the first message that made me stop scrolling. "You and I are actually a lot more alike than you and Danny." I read it twice. Josh had not replied. A few days later, Kayla had sent another message about something unrelated, and the conversation had gone quiet again. Did you notice that one when she sent it? I asked. My voice sounded calmer than I felt, but I wasn't angry at Josh. I was trying to understand the sequence before I decided what I thought about it. I noticed it was weird, he said. I thought maybe she was trying to compliment me and doing it badly. I didn't want to turn one awkward sentence into a family problem. That made sense to me. If he'd come running to me after one strange comparison, I probably would have told him Kayla had poor boundaries and to ignore it. My sister had always been emotionally expressive in ways I wasn't, and she could make casual comments sound more intimate than she meant. At least, that was what I had believed. I kept scrolling. The next shift was harder to explain away. Kayla sent him a message late one evening after a family dinner. Sometimes I think you understand me better than people who've known me my whole life. Josh hadn't answered that one either. Then she wrote, Danny is lucky. She doesn't always realize how lucky she is. I looked up at him. And you still didn't answer? No? He folded his arms on the table. By then I didn't like where it was going. I appreciated that he wasn't trying to turn himself into some heroic victim of my sister's attention. He gave me dates, context, and exactly what he'd done each time. He wasn't asking me to believe his interpretation. He was letting the thread show me what had happened. There was a gap of almost a week before Kayla tried again. This time she wrote, Can I ask you something without you making it weird? Josh had responded, Depends on the question. Kayla's next message was the one that changed everything. If you had met me first, do you think things would be different? I felt something cold settle under my ribs. Not jealousy. Even then, I wasn't afraid Josh was secretly waiting for my younger sister to make her move. I knew the man sitting across from me, and the fact that he had put his phone in my hands before making any other decision told me more than Kayla's fantasy ever could. What bothered me was that she had looked at my fiancé, looked at our wedding 3 weeks away, and decided that was still an acceptable question to ask. Josh's reply was directly underneath it. No. And I don't think we should have this kind of conversation. No smiley face. No softened ending. No, maybe in another life. He had answered the question and closed the door. Kayla didn't take the answer. The following morning she wrote, I wasn't trying to make you uncomfortable. Later that afternoon came another message. You don't have to act like I said something terrible just because I'm being honest. Josh ignored both. 2 days passed. Then she sent, I know you're marrying Danny. I'm not asking you to do anything. Several hours later, she followed it with, I just needed you to know that sometimes I wonder whether you met the wrong sister first. I put the phone down for a moment. My hands weren't shaking, but I needed to stop reading long enough to organize what I was seeing. Kayla had taken a direct no and converted it into a moral argument about honesty. In her version of the conversation, the problem wasn't that she had crossed a line. The problem was that Josh wouldn't validate how sincere her feelings were. How long have you been sitting on this? I asked. Not long. Josh glanced toward the phone. I wanted to be sure I wasn't showing you one stupid message and creating something bigger than it was. Once she asked if meeting her first would have changed anything. I told her no. When she kept going after that, I knew you needed to see it. I nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me. He reached across the table, but didn't grab my hand until I turned mine over and let him. I'm sorry you have to deal with this. I'm sorry she dragged you into it. Don't apologize for something you didn't do. That sentence landed harder than he probably intended. In my family, Kayla's emotions had a way of becoming everyone's assignment, especially mine. If she was upset, someone needed to fix the situation. If I was upset about something she'd done, someone usually wanted me to consider how badly she already felt. Josh had just separated those things in one sentence. Kayla had made a choice, and neither of us was responsible for making that choice easier for her to live with. My first instinct had been to take the phone, call my sister, and tell her exactly what I thought of her behavior. 10 minutes earlier, I probably would have done it. But anger would have given Kayla room to turn the conversation into how I spoke to her instead of what she'd done. More importantly, I no longer wanted to handle it alone. We need to talk to her, I said. Both of us. Josh nodded. Okay, and my parents need to be there. That gave him pause. You think they already know? I don't know. At that point, I genuinely didn't. But if we deal with this privately and she tells them a different version later, we'll end up having the same conversation twice. I want everyone hearing the same facts at the same time. Josh gave me the small, tired smile he used whenever my work brain took over. I managed operations for a living, and when something went wrong, I wanted the timeline, the people involved, and the next decision clearly defined. I wasn't trying to build a case against my sister. I wanted one conversation that couldn't be rewritten afterward. Before I called anyone, I picked the phone back up. Is there more? Josh hesitated. Yes. That one word tightened something in my chest again. I continued down the thread, past Kayla's attempts to explain why her questions shouldn't count as crossing a line. Then I found another message, sent after Josh had already told her we shouldn't be having this kind of conversation. I just wish I could ask you once, when Danny isn't standing there. I stared at it. What is that supposed to mean? I didn't ask. You never met her alone? No. She ever ask you to? Not directly after that, and if she had, I would have said no. I believed him. What unsettled me was the assumption buried inside Kayla's sentence. She seemed to believe my presence changed Josh's answer. If I weren't there, if I weren't part of the equation, then maybe something different would emerge. I handed the phone back to him. She thinks you're censoring yourself because of me. She's wrong. I know. That was the strange part. The person I trusted most in the situation was the man my sister was supposedly trying to take from me. Josh hadn't given me a reason to doubt him, and I wasn't going to manufacture one just because Kayla wanted there to be a love triangle. There were only 2 people in my relationship, and Kayla wasn't one of them. We agreed not to call her that night. I wanted 24 hours before the conversation, not because I planned to forgive anything, but because I wanted to know exactly what boundary I was setting before I spoke. Josh agreed that he would be there, and that he would answer Kayla directly if she tried to claim his silence meant something else. For the first time since he'd handed me the phone, I felt less angry than certain. Then I noticed he'd stopped scrolling before the bottom of the conversation. What? I asked. Josh looked at me for a second, then unlocked the screen again. There's one more thing. He moved down to the most recent message, the one he'd received that morning. I read the first line, and every remaining excuse I had been making for my sister disappeared. Then Josh scrolled to the message that made my stomach drop. I think I fell for you before I understood what was happening. I read Kayla's confession once. Then again, not because the words were difficult to understand, but because I wanted to make sure I wasn't reacting to something that wasn't actually there. I think I fell for you before I understood what was happening. There was no question mark, no attempt to disguise it as concern about my relationship, no way to explain it as an awkward joke. My younger sister had told my fiancé she was in love with him 3 weeks before our wedding. I kept scrolling. Josh hadn't answered. Several hours after the confession, Kayla had sent another message. You don't have to say anything. I know Danny would never forgive you if you admitted you felt something too. That one made me look up. She answered for you, I said. Josh nodded. That's when I knew ignoring her wasn't going to fix it. Kayla had taken his silence, which any reasonable person would have understood as rejection after the boundary he'd already given her, and assigned it the meaning she wanted. If Josh didn't respond, it wasn't because he wasn't interested. In her version, he was afraid of me. The next message was worse, because it showed me how far that idea had already developed in her head. I'm not trying to destroy anything. I just think people should be honest before they make permanent decisions. Underneath it, Josh had finally replied, I've already been honest. I love Danny. There is nothing between you and me, and there is nothing I need to reconsider. Kayla had responded almost immediately. You don't have to be cruel. Josh didn't answer again. That was the end of the thread until the message he'd received that morning, the confession I'd just read. He had brought the phone to me that evening before replying, before blocking her, before calling my parents, before doing anything that could later be described as a private fight between him and my sister. The more I looked at the chronology, the less room there was for ambiguity. Kayla had tested a boundary. Josh had identified it. She had pushed again. He had told her no. She had turned the no into proof that he was protecting me. I asked him to go through the timeline with me, from the first message that had made him uncomfortable. He did it without embellishing anything. The comparison between Kayla and me had bothered him, but he hadn't thought one strange comment justified involving me immediately. The question about what would have happened if he'd met her first had been the point where he stopped assuming awkwardness and recognized intent. He had answered because he wanted the answer documented in plain language. When she continued after that, he knew the situation belonged in our relationship, not in a private conversation with her. "Why not block her right after you told her the question was inappropriate?" I asked. It wasn't an accusation. I wanted to know what his reasoning had been. "Because I didn't want her telling herself I disappeared without answering," he said. "I thought if I said no clearly once, there wouldn't be anything for her to interpret." He gave a humorless little laugh. Obviously, I underestimated her ability to interpret. "So did I said. That was becoming the uncomfortable truth of the evening. I had known Kayla could be intense. I had known my parents tended to soften consequences for her. But I had never imagined she would look at a man 3 weeks away from marrying me and decide his refusal was merely the public version of a different private truth. I also understood Josh's choice not to block her at the first odd sentence. If he'd done that months earlier, and Kayla had come to me sobbing that my fiancé had abruptly cut her off for making a harmless comment, I probably would have asked him what had happened. He had tried to treat her like an adult capable of hearing a clear boundary. The problem was not that he had failed to communicate. The problem was that she had decided his words were negotiable. I picked up my own phone and opened my recent messages with Kayla. There was nothing there that hinted at any of this. She had sent me a picture of shoes the week before and asked which pair looked better with her dress. She had asked what time she needed to arrive at the chapel. She had complained that Mom was overthinking the rehearsal dinner seating. While she was telling me she couldn't decide between nude heels and silver ones, she was telling Josh she might be in love with him. That contrast made me angrier than the confession itself. Feelings could arrive uninvited. I understood that much. People developed crushes they didn't want. People occasionally fell for someone unavailable. The part you controlled was what you did after you recognized it. Kayla had made choices. She had contacted Josh repeatedly. She had compared herself to me. She had asked him to imagine a different life with her. Then, after he said no, she had kept going. "I don't want to call her tonight," I said. Josh looked mildly surprised. He knew I could be direct when I was angry, and an hour earlier I would have described directness as a virtue in every situation. But calling Kayla, while I was still staring at the messages, would have let her turn the next conversation into a fight about my tone. I didn't want to give her that escape. "Tomorrow," I continued. "Here. You, me, Kayla, Mom and Dad. Everybody hears the same thing at the same time." Josh studied me for a moment and asked, "Do you want me to show them the messages?" I shook my head. "Only if she lies about what happened. I don't want to humiliate her. I want this stopped." That distinction mattered to me then, and it still matters to me now. Revenge wasn't anywhere in my mind. I wasn't trying to punish my sister for having feelings. I wanted a clean boundary before my wedding and a family that respected it. Josh asked what I wanted him to say when we met. "The truth," I told him. "Don't soften it because Mom starts crying. Don't make it harsher because I'm angry. Just tell her what you've already told her." I could see the relief in that. Neither of us wanted a performance. There was no need for one. The messages already contained the problem. I sat back and finally let myself acknowledge how different this evening could have been if Josh had chosen secrecy. He could have deleted the messages because he thought they would hurt me. He could have blocked Kayla and hoped she stopped. He could have waited until after the wedding. Each of those choices would have left a private corner between us where suspicion could grow later. Instead, he had handed me the phone. I had spent most of my adult life assuming the safest way to stay independent was to make sure I could solve whatever happened without needing someone else. That night, for the first time in a long time, sharing the problem didn't make me feel less capable. It made the problem clearer. Before we finished, I asked to see the entire thread one more time, not because I wanted to torture myself, but because I wanted to know if there was anything else we were going to hear about tomorrow for the first time. Josh scrolled slowly while I watched. That's when one line I'd skimmed past earlier caught my attention. It came after Kayla had complained that he was acting as if she'd done something terrible simply by being honest. Mom understands why I had to tell you. I took the phone from him. Mom understands? Josh leaned closer. I noticed that too. I reread it. It could have meant Kayla had told Mom about the crush in vague terms. It could have meant Mom knew everything. What bothered me was that Kayla had written it as reassurance, almost as if my mother's approval mattered to whatever she was doing. Did she ever mention talking to Mom before this? I asked. Josh said no. He hadn't spoken privately with my mother about Kayla, and Denise had never contacted him about the messages. I called Mom before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the fourth ring with the distracted tone she used when she was watching television. Hi, honey. Everything okay? I told her I had one question and needed an honest answer. Did Kayla tell you she has feelings for Josh? There was a pause. Not a long one, but long enough to tell me I hadn't surprised her. She said she had a little crush, Mom replied. I told her that happens sometimes. You can't control feelings. I looked across the table at Josh. He couldn't hear every word, but he could see my face. How long have you known? I asked. Mom sighed. I don't know, Danny. A few weeks, maybe. She was embarrassed. I didn't think it was something to turn into a crisis. It became a crisis when she started messaging my fiancé. Another pause followed. Then Mom said, What exactly did she say to him? That wasn't the answer I had asked for. Did you know she was messaging him? I repeated. Mom's voice immediately took on that soft, careful quality she used when she believed I was being too rigid. I knew she wanted to be honest about how she felt. I don't know every conversation she has, Danielle. I noticed the wording. She didn't say no. She said she didn't know every conversation. She told him she thinks she fell for him, I said. She asked whether things would be different if he'd met her first. He told her no. She kept messaging him anyway. Mom exhaled slowly. Feelings aren't a crime. I didn't say they were. Then don't talk about her like she's done something criminal. I'm talking about behavior, Mom. She can feel whatever she feels. She cannot pursue my fiancé after he's told her to stop. Mom went quiet. For a moment, I hoped the distinction had landed. Then she said, She's going to be humiliated when she finds out he showed you. That sentence told me more than the rest of the call. My mother had just learned that one daughter had repeatedly contacted the other daughter's fiancé after being told no, and her immediate concern was how embarrassed Kayla would feel when confronted with it. I wasn't shocked enough to argue. I had seen versions of that reflex my whole life. When Kayla made a mistake, Mom's first instinct was usually to protect her from the emotional impact of knowing she'd made it. What I hadn't understood yet was how dangerous that reflex could become when the consequence Kayla was being protected from was a simple, necessary word, no. We're meeting here tomorrow, I said. All of us. Josh is going to be here. Dad, too. Mom's tone sharpened. Why does your father need to be involved? Because this wedding involves our family, and I am not having separate conversations that get retold differently afterward. You're making this sound much bigger than it needs to be. Kayla made it bigger when she kept contacting him. Mom tried again. Can you at least talk to me first before you put her in a room with everyone? No. Danny? No separate versions, Mom. Tomorrow, 7 o'clock. She didn't agree so much as stop fighting the invitation. Before she hung up, she said, Just remember she's your sister. I almost answered with something sharp. Instead, I said, That's exactly why we're dealing with it before the wedding. After the call, Josh asked what she'd admitted. She knew about the crush, I said. She won't tell me clearly whether she knew about the messages. He asked if I thought Mom had encouraged Kayla. I shook my head. I don't know, and I'm not going to invent that part. I had evidence for one thing. Mom knew Kayla had feelings for him before I did. Everything beyond that was still a question. I wasn't going to accuse her of something because it fit the worst interpretation. That would have made me no better at handling facts than the people I was angry with. Josh stood to clear the dinner containers, but I caught his hand before he moved away. We need our own rule before tomorrow. He sat back down. I told him I didn't want Kayla contacting him privately again, but I also didn't want him feeling as if he needed my permission to enforce his own boundary. If she contacts you, you tell me. If she tries to get you alone, you leave. I don't want to be your chaperone around my sister, he nodded. Agreed. And if she contacts you about me, I want to know too. No separate channels. That was easy to agree to. We weren't making rules because I distrusted Josh. We were eliminating the private spaces Kayla had been trying to create between us. Then we talked about the wedding. I admitted that part of me wanted to remove Kayla from the guest list immediately. Josh didn't tell me I was overreacting, and he didn't tell me to do it. She's your sister, he said. I'll follow your lead on whether she's invited. But whether she's invited or not, I'm done having private contact with her. I appreciated the distinction. He wasn't asking me to choose between him and my family. He was defining what access he would no longer allow. I told him I didn't want our wedding remembered as the event we spent 3 weeks preparing to defend from my sister. If Kayla heard a clear no tomorrow, accepted the boundary, and behaved like a guest, I was willing to let her attend. That wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't sacrifice. It was one final opportunity for an adult to act like an adult after being told exactly where the line was. I sent the group message before we went to bed. I kept it short. Mom, Dad, Kayla, Josh and I need all 3 of you here tomorrow at 7 to discuss the messages Kayla has been sending him and boundaries before the wedding. I want everyone present so there is no confusion later. Dad responded first with, "Okay, we'll be there." Kayla didn't reply immediately. Mom did, but not in the group. Her private message arrived less than a minute later. Please don't corner your sister. I stared at those 5 words until Josh asked what she'd written. I showed him. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Neither did I. I didn't know whether Kayla had called Mom after our conversation. I didn't know whether Mom already knew every message we'd read. I didn't know what Kayla had told her. What I did know was that Mom hadn't seen the full thread, hadn't heard Josh explain what happened, hadn't sat in the room with any of us, and her first instinct was already to protect Kayla from being confronted. I typed, erased, and retyped my answer before finally sending, "No one is cornering her. We're discussing what happened with everyone present." Mom didn't respond right away. Dad added a simple thumbs up to the group. A few minutes later, Kayla finally wrote, "Fine." There was no apology and no question about what Josh had shown me. That told me she already knew exactly why we were meeting. I set my phone on the nightstand and told myself tomorrow would be uncomfortable but simple. Josh would say no in front of everyone. Kayla would hear it without room to reinterpret silence. My parents would understand the boundary. We would finish the conversation, get through the next 3 weeks, and have our wedding without this hanging over us. Looking back, that confidence seems almost naive, but at the time it felt reasonable. I wasn't asking my family to choose sides. I was asking them to respect a line that should never have needed explaining in the first place. My phone lit up again before I turned off the lamp. It was another private message from Mom. I opened it, expecting another request that I be gentle with Kayla. Instead, she wrote, "Whatever happens tomorrow, remember that Kayla is already hurting." I read it twice, and something in me shifted. We hadn't even had the conversation yet, but my mother had already decided whose pain everyone needed to manage. By 6:50 the next evening, I had cleared every wedding binder, catering invoice, and centerpiece sample off the dining table. I didn't want Kayla walking in and turning the conversation into a discussion about how stressed everyone was because the wedding was only 3 weeks away. The problem was simple enough without decorations around it. She had contacted my fiancé repeatedly. He had told her clearly that he wasn't interested, and she had continued anyway. Josh's phone sat face down near his elbow, not displayed like evidence in a courtroom, but available if anyone decided to rewrite what had happened. Dad arrived first. Raymond had always been early, even for uncomfortable things. He hugged me at the door, nodded at Josh, and asked whether he should take his shoes off as if he were coming over to watch a football game. He knew why he was there because my group message had said it plainly. But he still tried to open with normal conversation. Traffic wasn't bad, he said. Your mother and Kayla are right behind me. I watched him settle into a chair and wondered how much Mom had told him. I didn't ask. That was the entire reason I'd called everyone together. No side conversations. No separate versions. Mom and Kayla arrived almost 10 minutes later. Denise came in first, carrying the expression of someone who had already decided she was entering a hostile room. Kayla followed without looking at Josh. She had dressed casually, jeans and a cream sweater, but her face looked carefully blank. No tears, no visible anger. For one irrational second, that made me hopeful. Maybe she understood how serious this was. Maybe embarrassment had finally done what Josh's direct rejection hadn't. Mom took the chair beside Kayla before anyone else could choose where to sit. That didn't surprise me. Dad sat across from them. Josh stayed beside me. I didn't close the distance between the two sides of the table because pretending this was an ordinary family discussion would have been dishonest. We weren't there to negotiate a misunderstanding. We were there to establish what had happened and what would happen next. I think everyone knows why we're here, I said. But I'm going to say it once, so nobody leaves with a different version. Kayla has been sending Josh messages about having feelings for him. Josh told her the conversations were inappropriate and told her he doesn't feel the same way. She continued after that. I want this stopped before the wedding. Kayla looked at me for the first time. You make it sound like I was stalking him. I said what happened. No, you said it in the worst possible way. Dad shifted in his chair. Mom touched Kayla's arm, and I saw the pattern beginning before we'd even made it 5 minutes into the conversation. The subject was already moving away from what Kayla had done, and toward how badly she felt hearing it described. I don't care whether we call it stalking, a crush, a confession, or honesty, I said. I'm not interested in finding the most flattering word. I'm interested in what happens from here. Kayla folded her arms. I wasn't trying to steal Josh from you. I believed that she believed that sentence. That was part of what made the conversation difficult. If Kayla had walked into my condo laughing about taking my fiancé, the problem would have been easier. Instead, she looked genuinely hurt that I could interpret her behavior as anything malicious. Then what were you trying to do? I asked. I was telling the truth. The truth about what? About how I feel. I know what you feel. What were you asking Josh to do with that information? She opened her mouth, then stopped. Mom answered for her. Danny, people don't always have a plan when they say how they feel. I turned to her. Then Kayla can answer that. Kayla's jaw tightened. I wasn't asking him to leave you. You asked if things would be different if he'd met you first. That was a question. You told him you thought you were falling for him. I wasn't asking him to do anything. You told him he didn't have to admit he felt something because I wouldn't forgive him. Her face changed then. It was small, but I caught it. She hadn't expected me to know that line. Until that moment, I think some part of her had still hoped Josh had shown me only enough to explain the confrontation without showing me everything. You read all of them? She asked. Josh answered before I could. Yes, I showed Danny the entire thread. Kayla finally looked directly at him. The hurt in her expression sharpened. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. I trusted you. That almost made me laugh, but there was nothing funny about it. Kayla, you were sending private romantic messages to my fiancé and expected him to keep them secret from me? I wasn't trying to make him lie. What did you think secrecy would be? Mom leaned forward. Enough. She already said she wasn't trying to break you two up. I looked at her. And I already said intent isn't the whole problem. Feelings aren't a crime. We established that yesterday. Then stop treating her like she's committed one. I took a breath before answering. This was exactly what I'd known would happen if I called Kayla alone. The minute she became uncomfortable, Mom would treat the discomfort itself as proof that the confrontation had gone too far. I'm not putting Kayla on trial for having feelings, I said. I'm saying she cannot repeatedly contact someone who has told her those feelings aren't returned. That's not punishment. That's a boundary. Kayla's eyes flashed. He didn't say they weren't returned. The room went still. I turned toward Josh, but I didn't need to ask him anything. I'd seen his messages. Josh stayed calm. I did. You said we shouldn't have that kind of conversation. And when you asked whether things would be different if I'd met you first, I said no. Because Danny is your fiancé. Because the answer is no. Kayla looked down at the table. You never actually said you don't feel anything. I saw Mom glance at her, and something about that glance bothered me. Not surprise. Not exactly agreement either. It was recognition, as if she'd heard the argument before. Josh leaned forward slightly. His voice didn't rise. Then I'm going to say it now. So there is absolutely no misunderstanding. I love Danny. I don't have romantic feelings for you. I never have. Kayla's face went pale. He continued because this was the entire reason we'd brought everyone into one room. If I had met you first, the answer would still be no. There is no version of this where I'm secretly waiting for a different opportunity. I'm marrying Danny because I want to marry Danny. Mom closed her eyes for a moment. Dad looked at the table. Nobody could later claim they hadn't heard him. Kayla swallowed. You don't have to humiliate me. I'm not trying to humiliate you. You could have just said you weren't interested. I did. Not like this. Josh sat back. We're here like this because you kept messaging me after I told you to stop. She looked at me as if I had forced him to say it. Are you happy now? No. The answer seemed to surprise her. I wanted you to stop before we ever needed this conversation, I said. I wanted Josh to tell me about the messages, you to understand the boundary, and all of us to move on. None of this makes me happy. Kayla blinked rapidly, fighting tears. Mom slid a hand over hers. You see? Denise said to me. This is what I was worried about. She's devastated. I stared at my mother. Mom, what exactly did you think was going to happen tonight? I hoped everyone could talk without making things cruel. What would have been less cruel? Josh pretending there was a chance? Of course not. Then she needed to hear what he just said. Kayla pulled her hand away from Mom. For a moment, I thought she might stand up and leave. Instead, she looked at Josh again. So you never once wondered? No. Not even before you got engaged? No. Even when we talked at Mom and Dad's? We talked because you're Danny's sister. That answer finally broke through something. Kayla's eyes filled, and she looked away. I didn't enjoy watching it. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired. There was a strange cruelty in seeing someone forced to let go of a fantasy, but the alternative was letting the fantasy keep invading my life. Dad finally spoke. All right. She heard him. Can we agree this ends here? His instinct was predictable. Identify the uncomfortable moment, declare it finished, move everyone toward peace before anyone had to examine how they got there. It ends here if the behavior ends here, I said. What does that mean? It means we need rules for the wedding. Mom's expression hardened again. Rules? Yes. Danny, she's your sister, not an employee. And this is my wedding, not a family therapy exercise. Dad rubbed one hand across his mouth. What are you asking for? I had already discussed it with Josh. I wasn't making it up in anger. I seriously considered uninviting Kayla. Mom immediately sat straighter. Absolutely not. I held up a hand. I'm not finished. Kayla's eyes were still wet, but now anger had joined the embarrassment. You were going to ban me from your wedding because I told someone how I felt? No. I considered uninviting you because you continued contacting my fiancé after he made it clear the conversation was inappropriate. Same thing. No, it isn't. And if you still think those are the same thing, that's exactly why we need this conversation. Dad looked at me. What did you decide? Kayla can still come. Mom's shoulders dropped a fraction. As a guest? I continued. Only as a guest. No bridal suite. No getting ready with me. No role in the procession. No speech. No surprise toast. No private conversation with Josh. No asking someone else to bring him to you. No messages from another number or account. And no attempt to turn the wedding into a chance to revisit this. Kayla stared at me. You think I'm going to stand up during your ceremony and confess my love? I think 3 weeks ago I would have said you'd never message my fiancé asking whether he met the wrong sister. I'm done basing decisions on what I think you'd never do. Dad winced at that. Mom looked offended on Kayla's behalf, but Kayla stayed silent. Josh spoke next. I'm blocking your number tonight. Kayla looked at him sharply. It's not punishment, he said. I'm not continuing private contact. If there's a family emergency, Danny has a phone. Your parents have phones. There is no reason you and I need a private channel. I wouldn't message you again anyway. Then the block won't change anything. Mom shook her head. This is all so dramatic. I turned toward her. What part? The lists, the blocking, making her feel like she's dangerous. I don't think Kayla is dangerous. I think she's ignoring a boundary. She's embarrassed. That doesn't make the boundary disappear. Dad raised both hands. Can we stop arguing around the same point? Kayla, can you agree to what Danny is asking? Kayla looked at him, then at Mom, and finally at me. Fine. Not fine because you're angry. I need you to understand. I understand. No messages to Josh. I said I understand. No private conversation at the wedding. Yes. No surprises. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Mom, so quickly that I almost missed it. At the time, I read it as embarrassment. Later, I would remember that look differently. No surprises, Kayla repeated. I turned to my parents. And I need something from both of you. Mom frowned. What? If Kayla gets upset over the next 3 weeks, you do not try to create closure for her. Dad looked confused. What does that mean? It means you don't arrange a meeting between her and Josh. You don't ask me to let her say one last thing. You don't tell me she needs 5 minutes because she's hurting. You don't create some family moment at the rehearsal dinner because everyone needs to clear the air. This conversation is the closure. Mom's mouth tightened. That's very specific, she said, because I don't want anyone claiming later that they misunderstood. Dad nodded before she did. Fair enough. I looked directly at him. Dad? He met my eyes. Nothing is going to interfere with you walking down that aisle. You have my word. The sentence softened me more than I wanted it to. He knew exactly what walking me down that aisle meant to me. I'd never been the little girl who planned her wedding from age 10, but I had always assumed that if I ever got married, my father would be beside me when the chapel doors opened. Hearing him say it so plainly felt like an anchor. Thank you, I said. Then I looked at Mom. She sighed. No surprises. I promise. I should probably tell you that I didn't hear sinister music when she said it. There was no hesitation long enough to make me suspicious. No smile that suddenly looked wrong. She sounded annoyed that I thought the promise was necessary, but she gave it. Dad gave his. Kayla had heard Josh reject her directly. Everyone in that room had the same information. I had no logical reason to believe 3 adults would leave my condo and immediately start searching for a loophole. The meeting didn't end warmly. Kayla stood first and said she wanted to go home. I didn't stop her. Mom followed her toward the door, then turned back as if she wanted to say something to me. Whatever it was, she changed her mind. Dad hugged me before leaving and whispered, "It'll be okay." I wanted to believe him. Josh locked the door after them, came back to the table, and blocked Kayla's number without ceremony. Then he showed me the screen. Not because I demanded proof, but because we'd agreed there wouldn't be any hidden corners around this situation. "You okay?" he asked. "I think so. That's convincing." I leaned against the back of my chair. I don't like that she had to hear it in front of everyone. Neither do I. But she was already finding ways not to hear it privately. Exactly. I reached for his hand. "Thank you for not making me choose between believing you and believing my sister." He squeezed my fingers. "You shouldn't have to choose. You have the messages." That was Josh. Even when he was reassuring me, he brought the conversation back to facts. Maybe that was one reason we worked. I didn't need grand declarations that night. I needed a partner who didn't hide information because he thought he knew which truth I could handle. After he went to shower, I sat at the table and wrote the shortest group message I could. I wasn't trying to create legal evidence. I managed complicated schedules for work, and I'd learned that the easiest way to prevent confusion was to put an agreement in writing while everyone still remembered it the same way. "Thanks for coming tonight. Just confirming what we agreed. Kayla is attending the wedding as a guest only. No direct private contact with Josh. No bridal spaces, no ceremony role, no speech, no surprise, and no attempt to revisit her feelings with Josh at the wedding." Josh and I considered tonight the end of that discussion. I added Josh to the same group because these were his boundaries too, then sent it. Dad replied first. "Understood." And I meant what I said. "Nothing is getting in the way of me walking you down that aisle." Mom answered a few minutes later. "Understood. No surprises, I promise." Josh, sitting on the other end of the couch after his shower, sent a simple, "Agreed." Kayla took longer. When her response finally appeared, it said, "I understand." I stared at the 5 replies lined up beneath my message. There it was in writing. No one could claim they hadn't understood. No one could say Josh had never rejected Kayla. No one could say my parents didn't know what I expected from them. Josh glanced over. "Do you still want her there?" I considered it seriously. "Yes." He didn't look surprised, but he waited for me to explain. "I'm not changing my wedding around her feelings. She heard you. She knows the boundary. Mom and Dad heard you. Everybody agreed. If Kayla behaves like a guest, she can sit in a chair like every other guest. And if she doesn't, then she made the decision for me." That answer felt right. I wasn't sacrificing my comfort to protect Kayla. I wasn't pretending nothing had happened. I was giving an adult one clear opportunity to respect a clear rule. If she couldn't do that, there would be no next conversation. For the first few days afterward, I kept expecting something. A message from Mom asking me to reconsider the block. An angry email from Kayla. Dad calling to tell me family was family. Nothing came. Kayla didn't contact Josh. Mom talked to me about flowers and arrival times without mentioning the confrontation. Dad called once about a transportation detail and sounded almost aggressively normal. A week passed, then another. Kayla did exactly what she had promised. She kept her distance from Josh. She didn't ask me to talk about her feelings. She didn't turn Mom into a messenger. When we were in the same family group chat about the rehearsal dinner, she responded only to practical questions. By the end of the second week, I stopped checking every notification with that small knot in my stomach. I thought the hard part was over. Everyone had heard the same no. Everyone had agreed to the same boundary, and my parents had put their promises in writing. For the next 2 weeks, Kayla did exactly what she had promised. That was why I stopped watching for the knife. By the time the rehearsal dinner arrived, the silence no longer felt temporary. That sounds insignificant until you understand how closely I had been watching for something to happen. Kayla did not contact Josh from another number. She did not send him an email, ask one of our cousins to pass along a message, or invent an emergency that required speaking to him. Mom did not call me to argue that blocking Kayla was cruel, and Dad did not suggest another family meeting so everyone could leave the wedding with a clean slate. The first few days, every silence felt temporary. By the end of the first week, I started believing silence might actually mean what I had hoped it meant. Kayla had heard no, my parents had heard the boundary, and everyone had decided to behave like adults. Josh never removed the block. He also never brought Kayla up unless I did. That was important because I did not want our last weeks before the wedding turning into a daily review of my sister's behavior. We still had seating confirmations, final payments, a marriage license appointment, a meeting with the photographer, and the ordinary collection of small decisions that somehow multiply as a wedding gets closer. One evening, I caught myself checking Josh's expression when a family group notification appeared on his phone, and I immediately hated that I was doing it. He noticed anyway. "You don't have to monitor me," he said gently. I told him I knew. Then I put my own phone face down and decided that if Kayla broke the agreement, I would deal with what she actually did. I wasn't going to spend the weeks before my wedding punishing myself for something she might do. The first real test came at the rehearsal dinner. Kayla had no role in the ceremony, so she was not part of the chapel rehearsal itself. That had been clear before any of this happened. She arrived later at the restaurant with the rest of the family guests, wearing a dark green dress and carrying a small gift bag for us. I saw her before she saw me, and for a few seconds I watched without meaning to. She greeted Dad, hugged Mom, and then noticed Josh talking to one of his friends across the room. Her shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly, but she looked away and joined a conversation with our aunt instead. I did not go over and test her. I did not demand an apology in front of everyone or make sure she understood that I was watching. When she eventually came to our table, she handed me the gift bag and said, "This is just something small for the condo." Inside was a framed picture of Josh and me from the previous Christmas, one Mom had apparently given her a copy of. The gift felt strange considering everything that had happened, but it was also exactly the sort of ordinary gesture I had said I would accept if Kayla respected the boundary. I thanked her. She said, "I hope tomorrow goes the way you want." Then she walked away, without looking at Josh. Later, while everyone was eating, Josh leaned closer and asked quietly, "You okay?" I told him I was. That was true. I was not waiting for Kayla to redeem herself over dinner. I only wanted evidence that she could exist in the same room with us without turning her feelings into our responsibility. For the entire evening, she did. She laughed with cousins, helped Mom gather some cards from a side table, and left with my parents before Josh and I did. There was no speech, no private approach, no dramatic goodbye. I drove home thinking, maybe for the first time since Josh showed me those messages, that embarrassment had done something useful. Maybe Kayla had finally accepted that feelings could be real without becoming instructions for everyone else. Dad reinforced that hope the next morning when he called about transportation. The chapel and reception venue were close enough that we had arranged only a few cars instead of anything elaborate, but Dad wanted to make sure he knew exactly when he needed to arrive and where he was supposed to be before the procession. We went over the timing twice. He asked whether I wanted him there early enough for pictures, and I said yes. As long as he understood, I did not want a long-staged father-daughter session while everyone else was trying to get ready. He laughed. "You've always been efficient, kiddo." I told him someone in the family had to be. There was a pause, and his voice softened. "I'm proud of you, Danny." That caught me off guard because Dad was affectionate, but he was not usually sentimental without a reason. He told me he was proud of the career I had built, the life I had made for myself, and the way Josh and I treated each other. He said he knew the last few weeks had been uncomfortable and that he wished the situation with Kayla had never happened. For once, he did not tell me to consider how my sister felt. He did not ask me to forgive anything before I was ready. He simply said, "Tomorrow is about you and Josh." I leaned against my kitchen counter and let myself enjoy hearing that. "Thank you. And don't worry about me being late," he added. "I'm walking my oldest daughter down that aisle. Nothing changes that." I smiled even though he could not see me. "You already promised me." "I know. I'm promising again." Looking back, that conversation became one of the hardest pieces of the whole story for me to understand. It would have been easier if Dad had sounded evasive or guilty. He didn't. He sounded like my father. Maybe he meant every word when he said it. Maybe at that exact moment, he still intended to keep the promise. What I eventually learned was that knowing an action is wrong does not always stop people who have spent their lives believing discomfort should be negotiated away. But that morning, I had no access to anything happening inside his head. I only had his words, his history, and the fact that he had already heard Josh reject Kayla directly. Mom was equally cooperative, although in a different way. She called that afternoon to confirm when she should arrive at the chapel and whether I needed her to bring anything from the house. We talked about my grandmother's small handkerchief that Mom had offered me as something old. And for several minutes the conversation was almost painfully normal. Then, just before we hung up, she said, "After you and Josh get back from your little trip, maybe everyone can finally put this whole thing behind us." I knew exactly what she meant. That depends on what everyone does. She sighed, but it was a small sigh, not the beginning of an argument. "Danny, I'm not trying to start anything. Neither am I. I'm just saying I don't want this hanging over every holiday for the next 10 years. Then nobody should give it a reason to." There was another pause. A few weeks earlier, Mom would have told me that Kayla was hurting or that I was being too rigid. This time she said, "Fair enough." That answer lowered my guard more than any apology could have. Mom did not ask me to unblock Kayla. She did not say Josh had been too harsh. She did not suggest one last conversation. She accepted the condition I had given her. Future peace would depend on future behavior. At the time, I heard maturity in that. Later, when I saw the messages she had sent Dad, I understood that the phrase "put this behind us" meant something very different to her than it did to me. The night before the wedding, Josh and I stayed home. Friends had offered drinks. My cousin wanted to organize a last-minute gathering. We turned everything down. I had spent months planning a wedding and did not want to arrive at my own ceremony exhausted because somebody decided tradition required keeping me awake until 2 in the morning. We ordered food, put our phones on silent except for emergency contacts, and sat on the couch with our feet tangled together while a movie played that neither of us was really watching. At some point, Josh asked whether I was nervous. I told him I was nervous about the schedule, the weather, whether one of the candles would set a centerpiece on fire, and whether the caterer would remember that his best friend was allergic to shellfish. "About marrying you?" I said. "No." "Good, because I was hoping to avoid a dramatic escape through a bathroom window." "You'd never fit through the bathroom window." "I've been working out." I laughed, and the tension I had been carrying all week loosened. Then I told him something I had been thinking about since the night he showed me Kayla's messages. "You know what scared me most about all of this? Your sister trying to interview for your position?" I elbowed him lightly. "I'm serious. So am I, a little." I told him that before him, my instinct had always been to solve family problems privately. If Mom was difficult, I handled Mom. If Dad avoided something, I talked to Dad. If Kayla created drama, I tried to keep it from spreading. I had not thought of that as a flaw. It felt like independence. "When you handed me your phone," I said, "my first thought was still that I'd deal with her myself. I didn't even notice I was doing it until you said it belonged to both of us." Josh looked at me for a moment before answering. "You can handle things yourself. That's different from having to." That distinction stayed with me. I had never wanted a husband who rescued me from my family. I still didn't. What I wanted, and what Josh had given me, was a partner who would not hide a problem to preserve my comfort and then expect me to be grateful for the protection. He trusted me with ugly information. I trusted him not to use my family's behavior to control my decisions. The more we talked that night, the clearer it became that Kayla had accidentally strengthened the exact relationship she had imagined she could destabilize. "The wedding doesn't have to be perfect tomorrow," Josh said. "Something will go wrong. The florist will forget a boutonniere. Somebody's phone will ring during the vows. Your uncle will probably complain about parking. He complains about parking everywhere." "Exactly. But none of that gets to decide what tomorrow means." I rested my head against his shoulder. "Neither does my family. Neither does anybody but us." I wish I could say that line prepared me for what happened. It didn't. But it gave me something to return to when the day stopped looking like the day I had planned. Saturday morning was mild and bright. The kind of late May weather Central Ohio sometimes gives you after making you check the forecast every 4 hours for a week. I woke earlier than my alarm, lay still for a few minutes, and waited for panic that never came. Instead, I felt strangely focused. Josh had stayed with a friend nearby, not because we were especially superstitious, but because it made the logistics easier. He sent me one message before I started getting ready. "See you at the other end." I wrote back, "You'd better." The chapel was already busy when I arrived. The photographer moved between rooms. My coordinator had her headset on and was checking the printed timeline against her phone. The videography team was setting up the package Josh and I had chosen months earlier, 2 cameras for the full ceremony, so we would have one angle on the altar and another covering the aisle. Josh would wear a small lapel microphone once he was dressed. At the time, I thought all of that was for vows, music, and the speeches we wanted to remember. I did not know those cameras were about to preserve the exact moment my family tried to rewrite what we had already agreed. Kayla was not in the bridal room. That mattered to me, and Mom knew it. My sister arrived at the venue on time and stayed with the family guests in another area. Mom came in and out of the bridal room several times, carrying things nobody had asked her to carry, fixing things that were not broken, and being so helpful that I finally told her to sit down for 5 minutes. "I'm fine," she insisted. "You just worry about yourself." She adjusted the edge of my veil, looked at me in the mirror, and said, "You look beautiful." There was no sarcasm in it, no resentment, no hidden warning that I could hear. I reached up and squeezed her hand. "Thanks, Mom." Dad arrived exactly when he said he would. I knew because the coordinator checked her phone and told me, "Your dad is here." A few minutes later, he came into the hallway outside the bridal room wearing the suit we'd chosen, already looking more emotional than I'd seen him at the rehearsal dinner. He hugged me carefully so he wouldn't crush anything and said, "You ready? Ask me again in 20 minutes. I'll ask you again in 20 minutes. He did. Dad spent the next stretch of time doing nothing suspicious. He stood for pictures. He joked with the photographer. He reminded Mom where she had left her reading glasses. At one point, he checked his watch 3 times in less than a minute. But I read it exactly the way any daughter would have read it on her wedding morning. My father was nervous about walking me down the aisle. Kayla crossed the far end of the hallway once while Dad and I were talking to the photographer. She was carrying her purse and speaking to one of our aunts. She saw me, stopped, and gave a small smile. "You look really nice." "Thanks." She nodded and kept walking. That was it. No tears, no attempt to come closer. No request for 5 minutes alone. I watched her disappear around the corner and felt the last knot of suspicion inside me begin to loosen. If she could make it through today without violating the boundary, whatever happened between us afterward could be decided later. I did not need reconciliation before dinner. I needed respect. As the ceremony time approached, the building changed rhythm. Conversations got shorter. Doors began opening and closing with purpose. Guests were moved into the chapel. The photographer checked the light near the entrance. My coordinator came to tell me we were running almost exactly on schedule, which she seemed to regard as a personal victory. Mom kissed my cheek and said she was going to take her seat. Then she stopped. "Actually, I need Kayla for one quick family picture first." I glanced toward the photographer, who was adjusting something near the chapel door. "Now? It'll take 30 seconds. The phrase did not register. Not then. "Fine," I said. "Just don't hold the procession." Mom smiled. "I won't." She disappeared toward the vestibule. I assumed she was grabbing Kayla for some picture with Dad before guests settled completely, or maybe a photograph of the 3 of them that the photographer had missed earlier. Weddings were full of tiny requests like that. Somebody always wanted one more picture. Somebody always realized too late that Aunt Susan had not been included in a group shot. I had no reason to turn my mother's request into evidence of an ambush. A minute later, Dad returned to me alone. "Where's Mom?" I asked. "Getting settled. Did she get her picture?" He looked toward the chapel doors. "I think so." That was the first answer that should have felt strange. It didn't, because the coordinator immediately stepped in front of us and started giving instructions. The The music had begun inside. The first members of the procession were moving. Dad offered me his arm, and I took it. His hand was slightly cold. "Nervous?" I whispered. He gave me a tight smile. "A little. You're not the one getting married. You're still my daughter." For one moment, I was 8 years old again, holding his hand to cross a parking lot. Then the feeling passed, replaced by the weight of the bouquet against my palm, and the awareness that on the other side of those doors, Josh was waiting. The coordinator checked the aisle through the narrow opening, then stepped back. "Okay. This is you." Dad tightened his hand around mine. The doors began to open. Warm light spilled across the floor. The music rose. I could see the first rows of guests turning toward us, and, beyond them, Josh standing at the altar exactly where he'd promised he would be. For one last second, I thought every promise had held. Then Dad released my arm. Before I could ask what he was doing, he stepped away from me, crossed to Kayla, and offered her his arm. Mom clapped twice and said, "Go on, sweetheart." Kayla took his arm, and together they started toward the altar. 1 step, 2, 3. Josh lifted his hand, palm out, and his voice carried through the chapel. 1 more step, and everyone here hears the truth. Dad stopped immediately. Kayla stopped with him, still holding his arm, and for a few seconds nobody moved. I was standing just inside the open chapel doors with my bouquet in both hands, staring at the 3 people who had promised me there would be no surprises. Then Mom stepped forward from the side of the vestibule and said, almost impatiently, "Kayla only needs 30 seconds. That sentence did something the sight of Dad walking away from me had not. It made the whole thing click into place. 30 seconds was not the language of a spontaneous, emotional breakdown. Nobody watched their younger daughter suddenly grab her father's arm and start down the aisle, then happen to know exactly how much time she supposedly needed. Mom had a number ready because somebody had discussed this before the doors opened. Kayla looked past me toward Josh. Her face was pale. But she did not look confused about why she was standing there. "I just need to say one thing," she called toward the altar. Josh did not lower his hand. "No. Josh, please. No. Kyla." Dad leaned closer to her and said something I could not hear, but Kayla shook her head. She seemed to be waiting for Josh to soften now that he could see her standing there without me beside him. That realization was worse than the embarrassment. 3 weeks earlier, she had written that she wished she could ask him once when I was not standing there, and somehow my parents had helped create exactly that moment at my wedding. "Josh," Dad said. "Louder now, don't make this ugly." I looked at my father. He didn't. Dad finally turned around. "You did," I said. There were nearly 90 people inside that chapel. Some were family. Some were Josh's friends and coworkers. Some were people who had never met Kayla before that day and had no idea why the bride's sister was suddenly attached to the bride's father halfway down the aisle. I could feel all of them watching us, but strangely, I was no longer embarrassed. Embarrassment requires uncertainty about whether you have somehow contributed to the situation. By then, I knew exactly where the responsibility belonged. Mom moved closer to me. "Danny, don't turn this into something bigger. She only wants 30 seconds to get closure." She already got closure. Kayla flinched. Mom lowered her voice as if the problem now was that strangers might hear us. "Not like this." "Exactly," I said. "Not at my wedding." Josh stepped down 1 level from the altar, but stayed where everyone could see him. He was not coming toward Kayla. He was not coming to rescue me. He was making sure nobody could later claim there had been confusion about what he had said. "Since we're apparently doing this here," he said, "then everyone needs to understand why I stopped her." Mom's face tightened. "Josh, no." He looked directly at Kayla. "You have been messaging me for months. Some of those messages were normal at first. Then they became personal. Then romantic. I told you I wasn't interested. I told you I loved Danny. I told you there was nothing between us. Danny knows. Your parents know. We all sat in the same room 3 weeks ago and had this conversation." A ripple moved through the guests. "Not chatter exactly. more the sound of people shifting as they understood that whatever they had assumed when Dad started walking with Kayla was wrong. Several faces turned toward Mom and Dad. I saw Aunt Carol's hand lower from her mouth. One of Josh's coworkers looked at the floor as if he suddenly felt embarrassed on our behalf. Kayla looked at Josh like he had slapped her. "You don't have to tell everyone. You didn't have to walk down our aisle." Dad let go of her arm then, but the gesture came much too late. He stepped toward me as though removing himself from the scene could somehow restore him to his old place. "Danny, listen. We can explain." I held up my hand. "Tell me what you promised." He stopped. 3 weeks ago," I said. "What did you promise me?" Dad looked at Mom. That was the wrong thing to do. I watched him search her face for help before answering his own daughter. "This isn't what it looks like." "Then tell me what you promised." "Danny, did you promise me nothing would interfere with you walking me down this aisle?" His jaw tightened. "Yes." I turned to Mom. "And what did you promise?" She looked around the room. "I am not doing this in front of everyone. You brought everyone into it when you put Kayla in my procession. That is not what happened." I almost laughed. Kayla was standing 3 steps down the center aisle in front of 90 witnesses, wearing no bridesmaid dress, with my father beside her. There was very little left to debate about what had physically happened. Josh reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out his phone. He was in the group thread because the boundaries were his too. I hadn't thought about that until that moment. My own phone was somewhere with my things near the bridal room, but I did not need it. "Give me that," I said. He crossed the short distance from the altar and handed it to me. I opened the thread and scrolled back to the night of the family meeting. My hands were steady enough that I remember noticing it. I had expected to be shaking if anything ever went wrong at my wedding. Instead, I felt almost detached, like I was reading a work email that contained the answer everyone in the room was pretending not to know. "I sent this after our meeting," I said. I did not read the rules about Kayla. I did not read her confession. I did not expose anything more private than necessary. I read only the words my parents had chosen themselves. Dad understood, and I meant what I said. Nothing is getting in the way of me walking you down that aisle. Dad looked down. Then I read Mom's message. Understood, no surprises, I promise. Nobody said anything. That silence was worse for them than yelling would have been. There was no argument to win because the evidence was 5 lines long. Dad had promised to walk me down the aisle. Mom had promised no surprises. Both had understood the situation completely. And yet there they were. Mom recovered first. "We can explain why we thought, not today, Danny. If you would just listen." "Not today." Kayla wiped at her face. I didn't know he was going to threaten to tell everybody. Josh's expression hardened. "I didn't threaten you 3 weeks ago. I answered you. You chose not to believe the answer. I just wanted to hear it when she wasn't sitting right next to you." The words were out before Kayla seemed to realize what she had admitted. I saw Mom's eyes flick toward her. I stared at my sister. "You already asked for that." Kayla said nothing. "That message," I continued. "You told him you wished you could ask once when I wasn't standing there." Mom stepped in immediately. She was trying to get clarity. "No, Mom." She was trying to get a different answer. "That is not fair." "What part isn't fair? The part where he said no? The part where all of you heard him say it? Or the part where you decided my wedding was the right place to test whether he might change his mind?" Dad finally spoke again. Nobody thought he was going to change his mind. That answer was almost more insulting. I looked at him. "Then what exactly were you doing?" He opened his mouth, but Mom answered first. We thought if he told her one more time, directly, without everyone staring at her, she could finally let it go. I looked around the chapel. Without everyone staring at her? Mom followed my gaze, and for the first time, she seemed to hear how absurd the sentence sounded. They had supposedly wanted to spare Kayla humiliation, so they had put her in the center aisle of my wedding ceremony in front of 90 people. Dad rubbed both hands over his face. This got out of control. "No. It went exactly where you walked it." He looked at me. and I saw something in his expression that I had not seen before. Shame. Real shame. But it arrived after the choice, not before it. I gave Josh his phone back and turned to Kayla. She looked smaller than she had 5 minutes earlier, but I was done confusing someone else's pain with an obligation to remove consequences. Get out of my aisle. She stared at me. Danny, you wanted your moment with Josh. You had it. He answered you again. Now leave. Mom immediately put an arm around her. She's upset. Then take her somewhere private. You want your own sister thrown out of your wedding? I want the person who just tried to use my wedding procession to get one last answer from my groom removed from the ceremony. Yes. Mom's mouth opened. And you should go with her. Her face changed. You're asking me to leave? No. I'm telling Kayla to leave. You are deciding what you want to do. That distinction mattered. I did not need to force Mom to make the choice she had made my entire life. I simply stopped protecting her from seeing it. Kayla started crying in earnest then. Mom turned toward her instantly, touching her shoulders, asking if she could breathe, telling her they were leaving. She did not look back at me for several seconds. When she finally did, her expression held accusation, as if I had placed her in an impossible position. I can't just let her go out there alone like this. I didn't ask you to. That was all I said. Mom guided Kayla back toward the vestibule. They passed me close enough that I could smell Mom's perfume. Kayla kept her face turned away. Neither apologized, neither stopped. I watched them walk through the same doors I had been waiting months to enter. And then they disappeared down the hall. Dad took a step toward me. I looked at him before he could speak. Sit down. His face went blank. Danielle, you're not walking me down the aisle. I know I made a mistake. You made it 3 minutes ago. I can still… No. He glanced toward the guests, maybe realizing for the first time that there would be no private repair before the ceremony continued. Please. I had never heard my father sound like that with me. A part of me wanted to make everything normal because that part had spent 39 years believing that discomfort should be resolved quickly, but normal was gone. If I took Dad's arm again, I would not be forgiving him. I would be pretending his choice had no consequence because the alternative hurt both of us. You promised me, I said quietly. His eyes lowered. Sit down, Dad. He walked to an empty seat near the front, not in the place originally reserved for him during the procession, but in the first available chair the coordinator indicated. Nobody applauded. Nobody whispered loudly enough for me to hear. My father simply sat among the guests and watched the role he had been given disappear because he had handed it to someone else. My coordinator approached cautiously. I had worked with her for months, and I could tell she was trying to decide whether professional composure required pretending she had not just witnessed the strangest procession change of her career. Danny, she said softly, we can pause. We can give you a few minutes. We can close the doors again if you want. I looked toward Josh. He was standing at the altar again, waiting. How far behind are we? She blinked. Maybe 4 minutes. Then let's go. Do you want someone else to walk with you? No. You sure? Yes. I adjusted my bouquet because one of the stems had twisted sideways while I was holding Josh's phone. My hands were finally starting to shake a little, but not enough to stop me. The photographer stayed out of my path. The videographer's cameras were still running. Somewhere in the front row, Dad was crying quietly. The coordinator gave the musician a signal. The music began again, not from the beginning, just enough to restore the entrance. Then she stepped aside. I walked. I had imagined that aisle dozens of times while planning the wedding. Dad at my left, guests smiling, Josh waiting. Instead, I walked it alone, and what surprised me most was how quickly the humiliation stopped belonging to me. The first few rows were still visibly shocked, but as I moved forward, people looked at me rather than past me toward the drama. Aunt Carol smiled through tears. Josh's mother pressed one hand to her chest. One of my college friends gave me the smallest nod. There was no cheering. I was grateful for that. I did not need my wedding turned into an inspirational movie scene. I needed to get to the man I had come there to marry. When I reached the altar, Josh held out his hand. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "No," I said. "Do you want to stop?" "No." That was enough. The officiant had the good sense not to begin as though nothing unusual had happened. He leaned toward us and asked in a low voice whether we were both certain we wanted to continue. We both said yes. He gave us another few seconds, then turned toward the guests. The ceremony itself was shorter than the chaos before it. Maybe memory compresses moments that feel safe, because I remember the important pieces more clearly than the transitions. Josh promising honesty even when honesty was uncomfortable. Me promising not to confuse independence with shutting him out. Neither of us altered our vows to punish my family. I never looked at Dad while I spoke. When the officiant pronounced us married, I felt the first clean emotion I had experienced since the chapel doors opened. Relief. Not victory over Kayla. Not revenge on my parents. Just relief that the thing they had tried to interrupt had happened anyway. Josh kissed me, and for those few seconds there was no sister, no 30 seconds, no broken promise. There was only my husband. The reception was in a separate venue, a short drive away, and my coordinator quietly adjusted the schedule before we arrived. I did not ask her to announce anything about Mom or Kayla. They did not come. Dad did. He arrived alone and kept to himself at first. I saw several relatives approach him, but I couldn't hear what they said. He looked older than he had that morning. Not physically different, obviously, but diminished in some way, as if he had finally realized that a father of the bride role was not a permanent entitlement attached to his name. The original reception schedule included a father-daughter dance after dinner. It also included a short welcome toast from Dad. Neither happened. I did not make an announcement canceling them. I did not walk to the microphone and tell everyone why my father no longer deserved those moments. The DJ quietly removed the song. The coordinator shifted the toast order. Dad did not ask me to reconsider. At one point, he approached Josh and me near our table. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" "Not today," I said. His face tightened. "I understand." I almost told him that if he understood, we would not be standing there. Instead, I turned back toward Josh when one of his friends came over to congratulate us. Aunt Carol asked me later what had happened before the ceremony. She was careful about it. "Your mother called me from the car," she said. She was very upset. That sentence told me Mom was already talking. What did she say? That there was a misunderstanding and things got out of hand. I took a sip of water. They broke an agreement we made before today. Aunt Carol waited, probably expecting more. "That's all I'm discussing at my reception." She nodded. "Fair enough." 2 other relatives asked versions of the same question. I gave versions of the same answer. I wasn't hiding what happened. Everyone in the chapel had seen enough to know there had been a deliberate choice. I simply refused to turn our reception into the second act of a family argument. Josh followed my lead. When one of his cousins asked, "So what the hell was that?" he said, a boundary that should have been respected, and changed the subject. We cut the cake ourselves. We ate the dinner we had paid for. I danced with Josh. I danced with friends. Dad stayed until late enough that leaving early would not become another scene, but he did not insert himself into any role that had been removed. Once, I saw him standing alone near the edge of the dance floor while a song played. He looked toward me. I looked back for a second, then turned when Josh offered his hand. That wasn't revenge. It was the natural shape of the day after Dad made his choice. By the time we got back to the hotel that night, I was more exhausted than emotional. My shoes were in one hand. Josh had loosened his tie. We had spent the final hour of the reception deliberately talking about anything except my family, and for the most part, it had worked. Then we were alone. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor for a while. Josh didn't push me to talk. He changed clothes, brought me water, and sat beside me. Eventually, I said, 30 seconds. He looked over. What? Mom said Kayla only needed 30 seconds. Josh was quiet. Why 30? I asked. Why not 5 minutes? Why not just say she needed to talk to you? She already knew how long. Josh leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I was thinking about that too. Then I remembered the message. I just wish I could ask you once when Danny isn't standing there. Josh nodded. That was the condition she wanted. I looked at him. At the family meeting, Kayla had not been able to accept his answer because I was sitting beside him. According to her, my presence contaminated the rejection. She had wanted one moment when he could see her without me right there. At the wedding, the plan had placed me at the doors, Josh at the altar, and Kayla between us. Exactly where she wanted to be. She couldn't arrange that herself, I said. Not at the chapel. She wasn't in the procession. She wasn't even supposed to be in the vestibule. Your mom brought her there. For a family picture. Josh didn't say anything. I replayed the minutes before the doors opened. Mom disappearing to get Kayla. Dad returning alone. His cold hand around mine. His strange answer when I asked about the picture. Then the doors opening, and Dad stepping away like he'd been waiting for a cue. For most of the day, I had thought my parents had made an unforgivable decision in the moment. Maybe Kayla had panicked. Maybe Mom had begged Dad to give her one last chance. Maybe all three of them had lost their judgment 5 minutes before the ceremony. But people who panic don't usually agree on a 30-second window. Someone planned it, I said. Josh looked at me. Yeah. The betrayal changed shape in that moment. Kayla had wanted another chance. I already knew that. What I didn't know was how a guest with no place in my procession ended up standing in the vestibule at exactly the right time, with my mother encouraging her and my father ready to escort her. That was when I stopped asking why Kayla had done it, and started asking who had planned those 30 seconds for her. We left for our mini honeymoon the next morning because I refused to let my family take that too. Josh had asked me the night before whether I wanted to cancel, stay in Columbus, and deal with whatever fallout was already forming. I told him no. The entire point of the last 3 weeks had been that Kayla's feelings did not get to reorganize our life. If I canceled the first trip I took with my husband because my mother and sister had created a crisis at our wedding, I would be doing exactly what I had said I would not do. It was only a few days away, nothing elaborate, and I turned off most of my notifications before we left. Dad sent one message that morning. I'm sorry. I know that isn't enough. I won't keep contacting you while you're away. I read it, showed Josh, and did not answer. Mom sent 4 messages in the first 3 hours. The first said she hoped we were safe. The second said she could not believe I had made Kayla leave in front of everyone. The third said, there are things you don't know. The fourth asked me to call before I let one terrible moment destroy our family. I did not respond to those either. Kayla sent nothing. Josh still had her blocked, and I had not blocked her because I wanted any decision I made about my sister to be deliberate rather than something I did while I was furious. She did not call, text, email, or try to reach me through anyone else while we were away. Part of me wondered whether she was finally embarrassed enough to understand that there was nothing left to say. Another part suspected Mom was speaking for her, which would have been completely consistent with how they handled conflict. For the first day, I checked my phone more often than I wanted to admit. By the second, I stopped. Josh and I walked, ate too much, took bad pictures of each other, and managed to have stretches of several hours where nobody said the words Kayla, Denise, Raymond, Isle, or 30 seconds. Those hours mattered. They reminded me that my marriage was not a crisis response. We had a life before my sister's obsession with Josh became visible, and we still had one afterward. One afternoon, while we were sitting outside with coffee, Josh asked a question I had been avoiding. What are you going to do about your dad? I don't know yet. Your mom? I know more about that. He waited. I'm not talking to her until she can say what she did without turning it into what I did to Kayla. Josh nodded. And Kayla? Same problem, different reason. I had expected to feel pressure to make permanent decisions quickly. Instead, the more distance I got from the wedding, the less interested I became in dramatic declarations. I did not need to announce that I would never speak to my mother again. I did not need to decide whether Dad would be allowed at Thanksgiving 3 days after he gave my Isle to my sister. All I needed to decide was what access they had right now. Right now, the answer was almost none. When we came home, the flowers from the reception were dead in the vases we had left on the counter. Wedding cards were stacked on a chair. My dress was still with the cleaner. Ordinary evidence of a marriage surrounded us while my phone held a completely different record of the day. The first person I called was not a relative. It was our wedding coordinator. I wanted to thank her. She sounded relieved to hear from me. "I've been debating whether to reach out," she said. "I didn't want to bother you on your trip. You did exactly what I needed you to do. I wish I'd caught what was happening sooner." "You couldn't have. They didn't tell you." She hesitated. "I want to make sure you know that because I've been replaying it. Your mother said she needed your sister for a quick family photo. I assumed she meant before she took her seat. Your father was already positioned with you. Nobody told me they were changing the procession." "I know. And when your dad stepped away, it happened so fast. By the time I understood, they were already moving." "I know that too." The fact that she remembered it the same way I did settled something in me. Not because I thought I had imagined what happened, but because my mother had already begun using the word misunderstanding. The coordinator's account removed that word completely. There had been no processional mix-up, no staff error, no moment where Kayla accidentally stood in the wrong place. Mom had deliberately brought her into the vestibule under a false reason. Dad had been in the correct position beside me until the doors opened. I asked whether the videography team had captured the beginning. "Yes," she said. "Both ceremony cameras were rolling before the doors opened. That's standard for the package you booked. One camera was on the altar, one was covering the aisle and entrance. Your husband's microphone was live too." I closed my eyes for a second. I remembered discussing that package months earlier. Josh had wanted 2 camera angles because he said if we were paying for a ceremony video, he wanted to actually see me enter, instead of watching the back of everyone's heads. At the time, it had seemed like one of those unnecessarily specific wedding purchases that couples argue about for 20 minutes and forget forever. "Do we get all of that?" I asked. "You get an edited ceremony and the raw ceremony files. The full edit takes several weeks, but I can ask them when the raw ceremony footage will be ready. You don't need to rush them." I meant it. I was not building a revenge package. I did not need a video to prove to myself what had happened. But knowing a neutral camera had preserved the scene felt important because my mother was already turning intent into ambiguity. The first family call came that evening. Aunt Carol asked whether we were back in town, then spent several minutes asking about the trip before eventually saying, "Your mother called me twice." I assumed she had. Carol sighed. "I don't want to be in the middle." "Then don't be." "I mean that. So do I." There was a pause. "She says Kayla had been struggling for months." "I know. She says you knew." "I knew 3 weeks before the wedding, when Josh showed me the messages." She made it sound like this had been an ongoing family issue for a long time. "It wasn't an issue in my relationship until I learned about it." Carol lowered her voice, as though Mom might somehow hear us from another part of the city. She also said Josh had been texting Kayla back. I went still. That sentence was technically true in the most misleading way possible. "He did answer some messages," I said. "When they were normal family messages. When they became inappropriate, he stopped answering or told her directly that they were inappropriate. That's what I thought might be happening." "What exactly did Mom tell you?" Carol hesitated. "That the situation wasn't as one-sided as it looked at the chapel. That was the first time I felt something colder than anger." "What does that mean?" "She said there were messages that would make people understand why Kayla was confused." I looked across the kitchen at Josh. He was opening mail and watching my face. "Did she show you any?" "No. She just said Kayla hadn't invented everything out of nowhere." I let that sit for a second. "Carol, Josh showed me the entire conversation before the wedding. I figured you had seen it." He answered ordinary family messages. Then Kayla started comparing herself to me and asking whether things would be different if he'd met her first. He told her no. When she kept going, he told me, "We had a family meeting." He rejected her directly in front of Mom and Dad. Everyone agreed there would be no more private contact. Carol was quiet long enough that I wondered whether the call had dropped. Finally, she said, "Your mother didn't tell me there was a meeting." "Of course she didn't. She told me Kayla never got a chance to say what she needed to say. She got several chances. The answer didn't change. Carol sighed. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have called you with this. No, I'm glad you did. I don't want you thinking I'm choosing sides. You don't have to choose anything. Just don't repeat things you haven't seen. Fair. Before we hung up, she told me Mom had also called 2 cousins and my grandmother's sister. That made me laugh once, without humor. Denise did not want anyone in the middle, but she was apparently building the middle herself, one phone call at a time. When I told Josh what Carol had said, he put the mail down. She thinks the early replies help Kayla. She knows they don't if she sees the whole thread. Has she seen the whole thread? That was a good question. At the family meeting, Josh had not projected his phone onto a wall or passed it around. He had summarized what happened and been willing to show specific messages if Kayla lied. Kayla had acknowledged enough of the thread that the details never became disputed. Mom knew Kayla had messaged him. She knew about the romantic questions. She knew Josh had rejected her. But I did not know exactly what screenshots Kayla had shared with Mom before any of us confronted her. Probably not, I said. Josh picked up his phone. Want to send it to her? I thought about it. No. He looked surprised. Not yet. Why? Because if Mom is telling people you encouraged Kayla, I want to know what she's actually basing that on before I give her anything else to reinterpret. Josh nodded slowly. That makes sense. I hated how quickly our lives had shifted into evidence language. Full thread. Screenshots. Timestamps. What someone had seen and what someone had omitted. But the alternative was walking into another emotional conversation, where the loudest person controlled what everyone remembered. Dad called the next day. I considered letting it go to voicemail, then answered because I wanted to hear what he would say without Mom beside him. Danny. Is this a bad time? It's as good as any. He sounded tired. I want to apologize. I waited. I should never have stepped away from you. No. I knew I gave you my word. Yes. And I broke it. That was better than anything Mom had sent me because he was naming an action instead of calling the whole thing a terrible moment. But I was not ready to make it easy. Why? Dad went quiet. That's the question, Dad. Why? We thought Kayla needed one last chance to hear it directly. She heard it directly in my dining room. I know. Then why? Your mother thought I stopped him. No. You walked her. He exhaled. You don't get to explain your legs with Mom's opinion. I know. Do you? Yes. The word sounded small. I leaned against the counter. When did you know what they were planning? Another silence. Dad? Before the ceremony. How long before? I don't want to get into every detail on the phone. That answer made every alarm in me go off. I didn't ask for every detail. I asked when you knew. It wasn't weeks. Was it the morning of the wedding? He did not answer. Was it the night before? Danny? There it was. Not denial. I closed my eyes. You knew before you called me that morning. I had concerns about it. The phrase was so passive that for a second I thought I had misheard him. Concerns? I told your mother I didn't think it was a good idea. But you did it. Yes. After telling her it was a bad idea. Yes. After telling me nothing would interfere with you walking me down that aisle. His voice cracked slightly. Yes. I had wanted the truth. I had not expected it to hurt more than the scene itself. At the wedding, I could still imagine Dad had been pressured in the last minute, caught in Mom's urgency and Kayla's tears, and made the worst spontaneous decision of his life. That possibility was disappearing. How far in advance did you know? I asked again. I need to talk to you in person. No. Danny, if you can't tell me on the phone, I'm not inviting you into my house to give me half an answer in person. It's not that. Then tell me. He was quiet for so long that I stopped expecting a response. Finally, he said, the night before. I sat down. The night before my wedding, Josh and I had been on our couch talking about how my family had respected the boundary. Dad had already spoken to me that morning and promised again that nothing would change his place beside me. Somewhere during that same day, he had learned there was a plan to put Kayla in my aisle. And he had not called me. Did you agree then? No. The answer came quickly. What happened? Your mother said Kayla couldn't move on because every time Josh rejected her, you were there. That isn't true. Some of his rejection was by text. I know that now. You knew it then. We talked about the messages. Dad sighed. I knew there were messages. I didn't know every line. But you knew enough. Yes. What did Mom want? He paused again. She said Kayla wanted 30 seconds. The phrase hit differently hearing it from him. 30 seconds to do what? Say one thing. What thing? I don't know exactly. Dad, I don't. I swear. Your mother said Kayla wanted to ask Josh one final question, he would answer, and then it would be over. And you thought my wedding aisle was the appropriate place? No. But you agreed. Eventually, I rubbed my forehead. Why? Because your mother said if we stopped Kayla from doing it, she would spend years believing everyone protected you from the truth. I stared at the wall. There it was again. The same distorted logic. Josh's refusal could not simply be Josh's refusal. If Kayla did not like the answer, then someone must be preventing the real one. Dad continued. I thought it would be quick. I thought she'd walk part way. Josh would tell her no, and we'd be done. You thought I would just stand at the doors and wait while you escorted my sister toward my fiancé. I wasn't thinking about it like that. That's exactly what you did. I know. No, Dad. You keep saying that now. I want to know what you knew before you did it. He started crying quietly. I could hear it in his breathing, and part of me hated myself for continuing. But that part was the same part that used to stop asking questions when someone else became more upset than I was. So, I'll ask again, I said. Before you walked away from me, did you know I would consider it a violation of what we agreed? Yes, that was the answer. I didn't need more that day. Okay. Danny, please don't hang up. I need to. I love you. I know. And I'm sorry. I know that too. I ended the call before he could tell me what he hoped I would do with his apology. Josh had been standing near the hallway. Close enough to know the call was going badly, but not close enough to hear every word. He came over when I put the phone down. The night before, I said. He sat across from me. Dad knew the night before. Josh did not say anything dramatic. He just reached across the table and took my hand. I keep thinking the thing I'm angry about is going to stop changing, I said. First, it was Kayla messaging you, then Mom knowing, then the aisle, then realizing the aisle had been planned. Now it's Dad knowing in advance. Because every answer moves the decision earlier. I looked at him. He was right. If Dad had panicked 5 seconds before the doors opened, that was one kind of betrayal. If he had known 5 minutes earlier, it was another. The night before meant he had gone to sleep with the plan in his head. He had woken up, gotten dressed, driven to the chapel, hugged me, taken pictures with me, promised again to walk me down the aisle. At every one of those points, he could have changed his mind. He did not. A few days later, the videographer emailed to say our raw ceremony footage was ready for download. The edited film would come later, but the 2 full camera files and audio from Josh's microphone were available through the client portal. I almost did not watch it. I knew what happened. I did not need to watch myself live through it again. Josh said we could leave it untouched until I wanted it, or never watch it at all. Then Mom called my cousin Emily. Emily called me afterward. According to Mom, Dad had simply reacted to a family emergency and had not understood what Kayla intended until they were already moving. According to Mom, Josh had escalated everything by threatening Kayla in front of guests. According to Mom, I had then humiliated my father by refusing to let him finish walking me down the aisle. That was when I opened the video. The aisle camera started several minutes before the procession. Guests were talking quietly. The coordinator crossed in and out of frame. The vestibule was partially visible beyond the open interior doors. I watched myself appear with Dad. Then Mom entered the edge of the frame with Kayla. She leaned close to her. There was no clean audio from them at that distance, but the body language was unmistakable. Mom touched Kayla's arm, pointed toward the chapel, then toward Dad. Kayla shook her head once. Mom said something. Kayla looked toward the altar. Then Dad approached them. The three of them stood together for almost 20 seconds before Dad returned to me. I paused the video. Josh sat beside me. That wasn't an emergency, I said. No. They had time. Yeah. We watched again. Dad came back to me. The coordinator began positioning us. Mom stayed with Kayla at the side of the vestibule rather than taking her seat. The doors opened. Dad released me. From the camera angle, the movement looked even more deliberate than it had felt from inside my own body. He did not stumble. He did not react to Kayla calling him. He turned, walked directly to her, and offered his arm. Mom clapped. Kayla took it. 3 steps. Then Josh's voice came through his lapel microphone, clear enough that I felt my chest tighten hearing it again. 1 more step, and everyone here hears the truth. The video did not give me a new fact. It did something more useful. It removed excuses. Nobody watching that footage could honestly call Dad's actions spontaneous. Mom was already beside Kayla. Dad approached them before coming back to me. He knew where he was going when he stepped away. I closed the laptop. I don't want to send this to anybody, I said. Josh nodded. Then don't. Not unless they make me. That became my rule. I was not going to distribute wedding footage because I was angry. I was not going to put clips online. I was not going to turn the most humiliating moment of my wedding into public content just to prove I had been wronged. But I also was not going to lie for them. Over the next week, relatives kept calling. Not dozens. My family was not some enormous dynasty with a phone tree, but enough people heard Mom's version that the pattern became obvious. She was telling everyone there had been a long emotional history between Kayla and Josh. She was emphasizing that Josh had once replied to Kayla. She was describing Kayla as confused, Dad as caught in the middle, herself as a mother trying to keep both daughters from destroying their relationship, and me as someone who had turned a painful, private situation into public humiliation. The part she kept skipping was the family meeting, the explicit rejection, the written agreement, and the fact that she had brought Kayla into the vestibule herself. Dad did not appear to be correcting her. That disappointed me almost as much as his original betrayal. He had told me he knew what he did was wrong. He had told me he wanted to apologize. But apparently shame was still easier for him in private than accountability was in public. Then Aunt Carol called again. This time she sounded angry. Your mother says Josh used to initiate conversations with Kayla. I stood up so quickly my chair scraped the kitchen floor. What? She says there are messages. Josh never initiated anything romantic. That's why I'm calling you. I put her on speaker and waved Josh over. Carol continued. She says Kayla showed her screenshots before the wedding. She says some of them prove Josh was warmer with Kayla than he's admitting now. Josh looked at me. Did she send you the screenshots? I asked. No. She read parts of them to me. What parts? Carol hesitated. One where he told Kayla which restaurant you two had gone to. One where he said, no problem. Another where he answered something about your mom's coffee maker. I actually laughed. Carol sounded confused. What? Those are the family messages from before Kayla started crossing the line. That's what I thought. Mom is using messages about restaurant recommendations and a coffee machine as evidence that my husband encouraged my sister? When you say it like that, yes. That's because that's what she's doing. Josh unlocked his phone. Ask her if Denise mentioned the message where Kayla asked what would have happened if she'd met me first. I repeated the question. No. The one where I told her that wasn't appropriate? No. The one where I told her there was nothing between us? No. I looked at Josh. There was our answer. Mom did have screenshots, just not the whole thread, and she was selecting the pieces that supported the version she wanted other people to hear. Carol said, Danny, I think you should know something else. What? Your mother told me Kayla sent her screenshots as the conversations happened. The room seemed to narrow. As they happened, that's what she said. She said Kayla kept her updated because she didn't know what Josh meant. I stared at the phone. That changed the timeline again. Mom had not learned about Kayla's crush in one embarrassed conversation a few weeks before the wedding. She had apparently been receiving pieces of the Josh-Kayla exchange while it was happening. Did Mom tell you what she said back to Kayla? No. Did she say she told Kayla to stop? Carol went quiet. No, she finally said. After we ended the call, I did not move for a while. Josh sat across from me, his phone still open to the full conversation. All along, I had assumed Mom's role began after Kayla confessed that she had feelings for him. Maybe Denise had known about the crush, minimized it, and then made a catastrophic decision at the wedding because she could not stand seeing Kayla hurt. But if Kayla had been sending Mom screenshots in real time, then Denise had known much more than she admitted at our family meeting. Possibly everything. I looked at Josh. She knew you were telling Kayla no. Looks like it. And she still told me she only knew about a little crush. Yeah. I thought about Mom's first reaction when I called her before the family meeting. What exactly did she say to him? At the time, I had taken that question as uncertainty. Now I wondered whether it had been something else. Not curiosity. A test. How much did I know? I opened my messages with Dad and stared at his name. He had admitted the aisle plan started the night before the wedding. But now I had a bigger question. If Mom had been receiving Kayla's screenshots for weeks, what had she been telling my sister every time Josh said no? That was the first moment I understood that the 30 seconds at my wedding might not have been the beginning of my mother's involvement at all. I waited until the next afternoon before calling Dad again. I did not want to make the call while I was angry enough to confuse suspicion with fact. By then, I had written down the pieces I actually knew. Kayla had been sending Mom screenshots while her conversations with Josh were happening. Mom had told me she knew only about a little crush. Dad had admitted he knew about the aisle plan the night before the wedding. What I did not know was whether he knew how involved Mom had been before that, or whether Denise had been shaping Kayla's interpretation of Josh's messages from the beginning. Dad answered on the second ring. Hi, Danny. Are you alone? He hesitated. Yes, good. I need you to answer something without checking with Mom first. Danny, I haven't been checking. Did you know Kayla was sending Mom screenshots of her conversations with Josh before the wedding? The silence on his end was immediate. That was enough to tell me the answer was not no. How much did you know? I asked. I knew Kayla talked to your mother about him. That's not what I asked. Dad sighed. Your mother showed me some things. What things? Messages. Screenshots. I don't remember everyone. Did you see Josh tell Kayla no? I saw enough to know he wasn't encouraging her. I closed my eyes. Then why are relatives calling me? Because Mom is telling them Josh gave Kayla reasons to think he was interested. I don't know exactly what your mother has been saying. Have you corrected her? He did not answer. Dad? I told her she shouldn't be calling everybody. That isn't the same thing. I know. No, you keep saying that after the fact. Did you tell Aunt Carol the truth? Did you tell Emily? Did you tell anyone Mom contacted that Josh rejected Kayla before the wedding? No. Why? Because I didn't want to make this worse. I almost laughed. You still think silence is neutral? I don't think that. Then what do you think you're doing? He took a long breath. I'm trying not to destroy my marriage while you're all furious with each other. There it was. The real answer. Not protection of me. Not protection of Kayla. Preservation of a structure that let him avoid choosing publicly while still making private decisions that always favored whoever was most upset. Mom is telling people my husband encouraged my sister. I said, if you know that's false and you let her say it, you're choosing. I understand. Do you? Yes. Then prove it. Dad went quiet again. I need to know what Mom was telling Kayla before the wedding, I continued. Not what you think she meant, not what she says now. What did she actually say? I don't have all of that. What do you have? He sounded uncomfortable. Some messages between your mother and me. About Kayla? Yes. About Josh? Yes. About the wedding? Another pause. Yes. That was the first time he had admitted there was a written record. I stood and started pacing across the living room. Josh was working at the dining table and looked up when he heard my tone change. I held up one finger to tell him I was okay. Why didn't you tell me that before? I asked. Because I didn't want to hand you pieces without context. Whose context? Danny. That is exactly the problem, Dad. Everyone keeps deciding I need someone else's explanation wrapped around the facts before I can see them. I'm not trying to manipulate you. Then stop withholding things because you think I'll react badly. He said nothing for several seconds. Then, quietly, you're right. I stopped pacing. It was not the apology I needed. But it was the first time he had said something without immediately cushioning it. Can you send me the thread? I asked. There's a lot. Then send the parts about Kayla, Josh, and the aisle. I'd rather show you in person. No, Danny. I am not sitting in your house while Mom explains every line over your shoulder. She's not here. I still want the messages before the explanation. Dad sighed. Some of them are things she forwarded me from Kayla. That caught my attention. What do you mean? Kayla would send your mother screenshots. Sometimes your mother sent them to me. Finally, the evidence chain made sense. Mom had not merely told Dad what Kayla was saying. She had forwarded pieces of the conversations themselves. That meant Dad's phone could contain Kayla's messages to Mom, Josh's messages to Kayla, and Mom's commentary about both. Send them. I need a little time to find everything. Fine. Don't edit them. I'm not going to edit anything. And don't ask Mom which ones she wants me to see. I won't. I ended the call feeling worse than I had before it. The problem was no longer whether Denise knew Kayla had feelings for Josh. She had known enough to preserve and forward selected messages. She had participated in interpreting them. The only remaining question was how. Dad sent the first screenshots about an hour later. There were 7 images, all from his thread with Mom. Each one showed a screenshot Denise had forwarded, followed by their own discussion underneath. The earliest was dated almost a month before Josh showed me his phone. The screenshot showed Kayla asking Josh, "Sometimes I think you and I are more alike than you and Danny." Underneath, Josh had not replied. Mom had sent the screenshot to Dad with the message, "She's getting attached." Dad had replied, "Then tell her to back off." I stared at that line for a long time. That was not the answer of a man who thought Josh had encouraged anything. Mom's response came next. "I did." "She's embarrassed." "Dad, good. Maybe that stops it." "Denise, don't be harsh. Feelings happen." That exchange by itself did not prove Mom encouraged Kayla. If anything, it showed that at that stage she had at least acknowledged there was a line. The next screenshot came several days later. Kayla had asked Josh whether things would have been different if he had met her first. Josh had replied, "No, and I don't think we should have this kind of conversation." Mom had forwarded it to Dad with one sentence. "That was blunt." Dad answered, "It was clear." Mom. "She says he only answered that way because he's engaged." Dad. "Of course he's engaged. That's the point." I actually felt relief reading that. For once, Dad's instincts had been exactly right. Then came Mom's reply, "Maybe. But you know how Danny is. Josh isn't going to say anything that could blow up 3 weeks before the wedding." I read it twice, then a third time. That was the first written proof that Denise had taken Josh's rejection and introduced an alternative explanation. Not to me, not even necessarily to Kayla yet, but to Dad. Josh came over and sat beside me. "What?" I handed him the phone. He read the exchange and looked back at me. "She thought I said no because I was afraid of you?" "Apparently. I wasn't." "I know." He scrolled down. "Your dad told her it was clear." "I saw. That's something." "It is." We kept reading. Another screenshot showed Kayla telling Josh, "I wasn't trying to make you uncomfortable." His lack of reply was visible beneath it. Mom had written to Dad, "She's devastated." Dad, "Then she needs to stop messaging him." Mom, "I'm trying." Dad, "Trying how?" There was no response to that question in the screenshot Dad had sent me. I called him. "Is there more after trying how?" He answered immediately. "Yes. Why didn't you include it?" I sent the screenshots I found first. "Send the next ones." I am. 10 minutes later, 3 more arrived. The next exchange began with Mom writing, I told Kayla maybe the timing is wrong and she needs to let it go. Dad, maybe? Mom, don't start. Dad, there is no maybe. He's marrying Danny. Mom, I know that. Dad. Then stop giving her language she can turn into hope. He sat back. Dad had seen it. He had identified the exact problem weeks before the wedding. Mom replied, I'm not giving her hope. I'm trying not to make her feel stupid. Dad, sometimes disappointment feels stupid. She'll survive. For the first time since the wedding, I felt something close to grief for my father that had nothing to do with the aisle itself. He had understood. He had seen the pattern clearly. He had told Denise not to feed it. And then, eventually, he had participated in the result anyway. That made his betrayal worse, not better. The next screenshot was more troubling. Kayla had written to Mom, Maybe I imagined the whole thing. Maybe I just wanted it to mean something. Mom replied, Or maybe you met someone at the wrong time. I stopped breathing for a second. There was no ambiguity in that line. Kayla had started to question her own fantasy. Denise had given it another route back to hope. Dad had apparently been sent a screenshot of that exchange afterward. Underneath, he wrote, Why would you say that to her? Mom answered, Because she's heartbroken. Dad, that doesn't make it true. Mom, I didn't say it was true. I said maybe. There it was again. Maybe. The entire situation had survived on that word. Josh had said no. Denise had said maybe. Kayla had said, perhaps she imagined it. Denise had said maybe not. Every time reality closed the door, Mom had left a window unlocked. I put my phone down. Josh watched me carefully. You want to stop? No. You don't have to read all of it right now. I know. That answer mattered. A few months earlier, I might have kept reading because stopping would have felt like weakness. Now I understood I could pause without surrendering control. I stood, got water, walked around the apartment, then came back, because I wanted the truth more than I wanted comfort. The next batch Dad sent contained the message that changed everything. It was a screenshot of Kayla's conversation with Mom from the week before our family meeting. Kayla, he told me we shouldn't talk like this. Mom, that's what he has to say. Kayla, what does that mean? Mom, it means he's marrying your sister. Kyla, so? Mom. So, he can't exactly tell you something that would blow up the whole family. I felt my stomach turn. Kayla replied, Do you think he feels something? Mom, I think people are more complicated than they admit. Kyla, Mom, I'm saying don't build your life around it. That's all. That last line was probably how Denise justified everything to herself. She could point to it and say she had never explicitly told Kayla that Josh loved her. Technically, she had told her not to build her life around the possibility, but she had created the possibility first. She had transformed a direct rejection into a social constraint. He wasn't saying no because he meant no. He was saying no because he was engaged to Danny, because the wedding was close, because the family would explode. That was not support. That was permission to disbelieve him. I called Dad again. This time, he sounded defeated when he answered. Did you see that one when Mom sent it? Yes. What did you say? I told her to stop. Show me. A minute later, another screenshot arrived. Dad, this is exactly what I told you not to do. Mom, calm down. Dad, you're making this worse. Mom, she's crying every night. Dad, then let her cry. She can't have him. Mom, I know that. Dad. Then why are you acting like there is some secret answer nobody can say out loud? Mom, because I don't know that there isn't. I read the last line slowly. That was Denise's fatal mistake, stripped of all the maternal language she used later. She did not know there was no hidden answer. That uncertainty was enough for her to keep the fantasy alive. Josh sat beside me, silent. I said, She didn't need evidence. No, she needed the possibility. Yeah. I picked up the phone again. Why didn't you tell me? I asked Dad. I thought your mother would stop. You knew she wasn't stopping. I knew she was saying things I disagreed with. You knew she was telling Kayla not to trust Josh's answer. I didn't know every conversation. But you knew enough. Yes. And you still let us sit at that family meeting while Mom acted like she barely knew anything. Dad's voice dropped. Yes. I stared out the window. Why? Because your mother asked me not to make Kayla feel like we'd all been discussing her behind her back. I laughed once. You had been. I know. And somehow protecting Kayla from knowing that mattered more than protecting me from being lied to. He did not answer. I could hear him breathing. Finally, he said, yes, that was the first time he gave me an answer without excuse. It hurt more than all the others. I asked him whether there were messages from the night before the wedding. He said yes. Send them. I will. All of them. Okay. The next set took longer. While I waited, I tried to understand Denise's motive without excusing it. She was not secretly rooting for Kayla to steal Josh because she hated me. That would have been easier. What she could not tolerate was watching Kayla experience a rejection she could not fix. If Josh simply did not want my sister, then there was nothing Mom could do. No problem to solve, no villain to blame, no hidden circumstance that would make Kayla feel better. So Denise created circumstance. The timing was wrong. The engagement made him cautious. I was sitting there. The wedding was too close. Maybe he felt something but could not say it. Every explanation protected Kayla from one unbearable fact. A person could know her, understand her, and still choose someone else. And because that someone else was me, the wound was even deeper. That evening, Dad finally sent the messages from the night before the wedding. The first one was time-stamped a little after 8. Mom, she's a wreck. Dad, about what? Mom, tomorrow. Dad, she knew tomorrow was coming. Mom, she keeps saying once they're married she'll never know. Dad, know what? Mom, whether he would have answered differently if Danny wasn't there. Dad, he already answered her by text. Mom, not everything. Dad, Denise knew. Mom, I didn't say anything yet. Dad, then don't. I could almost see the conversation unfolding between them. Several minutes later, Mom wrote again. She wants 30 seconds. There it was. Dad? For what? Mom, to ask him one question. Dad? No. Mom. Ray. Dad? Absolutely not. Mom, if he says no, she says she'll let it go forever. Dad? He already said no. Mom, with Danny there. Dad? Not all the time. Mom, you know what I mean. Dad? No, I don't. This is insane. I paused. Josh looked at me. Your dad said no. At first, we both knew that was not where the conversation ended. Mom's next message came 12 minutes later. Think about the next 10 years. Every holiday, every baby shower, every family dinner. She'll always believe we protected Danny from something. Dad. There is nothing to protect her from. Mom, you don't know that. Dad. Josh is marrying her tomorrow. Mom. Then 30 seconds changes nothing. Dad did not answer for almost half an hour. Then, where? Mom, before the procession. My chest tightened. Dad. No. Mom. Just hear me. Dad. We promised Danny. Mom. We're not stopping the wedding. Dad. We promised her no surprises. Mom. This isn't about the wedding. It's about ending this before it follows all of us forever. Dad. How exactly do you plan to get Kayla in front of him? Mom. I'll bring her to the vestibule for a picture. You walk her a few steps. Josh sees her. She asks the question. He answers. Done. I read that line and felt something inside me go cold. There was the plan. Not spontaneous. Not emotional chaos. Not a misunderstanding at the chapel. A picture. The vestibule. Dad walking her. A few steps. Josh answering. Done. They had diagrammed my humiliation in text. Dad responded. That means I leave Danny standing there. Mom. For 30 seconds. Dad. No. Mom. Then come right back. Dad, you are asking me to break my word. Mom, I'm asking you to help both daughters instead of choosing one. Dad, this isn't both daughters. Kayla is wrong. Mom, she's hurting. Dad, that doesn't make her right. Mom, I didn't say it did. Dad, then stop. I had to put the phone down again. That was Raymond in full clarity. He knew Kayla was wrong. He knew the plan meant leaving me standing there. He knew he would be breaking his word. There was no confusion, no lack of information. Just a man who understood the situation and was slowly being worn down by his wife because he hated conflict more than he respected the boundary he had promised to keep. When I picked up the phone again, the final messages were waiting. Mom, if we don't do this, she will never move on. Dad, that's not Donnie's responsibility. Mom, I'm not saying it is. Dad, you're making it her wedding's responsibility. Mom. 30 seconds, Ray. Dad, I hate this. Mom. Then let him tell her no and prove me wrong. Dad. And if Danny finds out? Mom, she'll be angry. Dad, that's not an answer. Mom. She'll understand eventually. Dad did not reply for another 20 minutes. Then he wrote the sentence that ended whatever excuse I still wanted to make for him. Fine. 30 seconds. Then it's over. I stared at it until the screen dimmed. Josh touched my shoulder. I did not cry. Not then. I felt something cleaner than grief. Finality. Dad had not been confused. Mom had not improvised. They had discussed my exact boundary, named it, acknowledged that the plan violated it, predicted I would be angry, and decided I would understand later. They had treated my consent as something they could obtain retroactively after getting what they wanted. I called Dad one last time that night. He answered immediately. I saw it. I know. You told her it was wrong? Yes. You told her Kayla was wrong? Yes. You told her it would break your promise to me? Yes. And you still agreed? His voice was barely audible. Yes. I let the silence sit. Then I asked the only question that still mattered. Why? He took a long time to answer. Because your mother wouldn't stop. Kayla wouldn't stop. And I convinced myself 30 seconds would end it. There it is. What? You didn't choose peace. You chose the person making the most noise. He started to say something. I cut him off. And you made me pay for it. Danny, I'm sorry. I believe you. He went quiet. I believe you're sorry now, I continued. That doesn't change the fact that you knew exactly what you were doing then. I know. Good, because I don't need another explanation. What do you need? The rest of the truth. I sent you everything I have. No. You sent me everything about the aisle. I want to know what Mom was telling Kayla every time Kayla almost accepted Josh didn't want her. Dad exhaled. There are more screenshots. I closed my eyes. How many? I don't know. Your mother forwarded things over weeks. Send them. Danny, some of them are going to hurt. Stop deciding which truth I can handle. He was silent. Then he said, Okay. The next morning, there were 11 new screenshots in my messages. I did not open them immediately. Josh and I ate breakfast first. I answered 2 work emails. I took a shower. Then I sat at the dining table with him beside me and opened the first image. It showed a conversation between Kayla and Mom from several weeks before the wedding. Kayla had written, Maybe I need to let it go. He keeps saying no in every way that matters. Mom's reply was directly underneath it. Or maybe he's saying what he has to say because Danielle is standing beside him. I stared at that sentence, and suddenly I understood that the aisle had not been designed to give Kayla closure. It had been designed to test a theory my mother had spent weeks teaching her to believe. The rest of the screenshots made the pattern impossible to ignore. There had been several moments when Kayla was starting to accept reality, and each time, Mom gave her another reason to doubt Josh's answer. A few days later, Kayla had written, I think I embarrassed myself. Mom answered, You told someone how you feel. That's not embarrassing. That part I could understand. If the conversation had stopped there, I would not have blamed Mom for trying to comfort her. Then Kayla wrote, "But he doesn't feel the same way." Denise responded, "You don't know what he feels. You know what he said." Those two sentences looked almost identical until you understood what Mom was doing with them. She was separating Josh's words from Josh's feelings, even though she had no evidence they were different. Josh sat beside me at the dining table while I read. He did not need to defend himself because none of it was about what he had done anymore. The full thread between him and Kayla was already clear. The new question was how many times my sister might have backed away if our mother had simply allowed a rejection to remain a rejection. Another screenshot showed Kayla asking Mom, "Why would he answer me at all at the beginning if there was nothing there?" Denise replied, "Because there may have been something before he realized where it could lead." I looked over at Josh. "The coffee machine," I said. He rubbed one hand across his forehead. "Apparently fixing your mother's coffee maker was foreplay." I laughed despite myself, then immediately hated how absurd the situation had become. The early messages had been so ordinary that I had never once felt threatened by them. Mom had taken the same harmless exchanges and taught Kayla to treat them as evidence that something might have existed before Josh became cautious. The next screenshot was worse because Kayla had challenged that interpretation herself. Or he was just being nice because I'm his fiance's sister. Denise replied, "Maybe. I just don't want you rewriting everything because you're hurt now." I read that line 3 times. Kayla had offered the most rational explanation available, and Mom had framed rationality as denial. I leaned back from the table. She was getting there. Josh knew exactly what I meant. A few times. She wasn't completely detached from reality. No, I hated how careful I had to be with that conclusion. Mom's encouragement did not erase Kayla's choices. Denise had not typed the messages to Josh. She had not forced Kayla to ask whether he had met the wrong sister. She had not taken Kayla's phone and sent a confession after he had already told her no. Kayla was 33 years old. She owned every message she sent, but there was a difference between saying my sister was responsible and pretending she had developed the entire delusion in isolation. The screenshots showed a feedback loop. Kayla felt something inappropriate, then tested it. Josh rejected it. Kayla became embarrassed and doubted herself. Mom comforted her by suggesting the rejection might not mean what it said. Kayla tried again. Each new rejection hurt more because Denise had kept alive the possibility that the next context would produce a different answer. I had seen smaller versions of that pattern before, although I had never recognized how destructive it could become. When Kayla was 17 and did not make the varsity cheer squad, Mom did not say, "I know you're disappointed." She spent a week telling everyone the coach probably favored girls whose parents donated more to the athletic department. When Kayla's college boyfriend broke up with her, Mom insisted for months that he had been intimidated by her ambition, even though he had plainly told Kayla they wanted different lives. When a promotion went to one of Kayla's coworkers years later, Denise immediately decided the manager was threatened by strong women. Sometimes external explanations were true. Sometimes people were unfair. The problem was that Mom reached for those explanations before she ever allowed Kayla to sit with the possibility that she had simply not been chosen. With me, she rarely did that. If I did not get something I wanted, Mom's answer was usually some version of, "You'll figure something else out." I had spent years thinking that meant she trusted me more. Maybe she did. But it also meant Kayla had grown up with an entirely different relationship to disappointment. I learned that a closed door meant I had to choose another direction. Kayla learned that if a door closed, Mom would help her search for the hidden reason it should still be open. Josh watched me for a while before asking, "You okay?" I'm trying to understand her without excusing her. "Your mom or Kayla?" "Both." He nodded. "Those aren't the same thing." No. That distinction kept me grounded. Understanding why Denise did something did not make the thing acceptable. Understanding why Kayla had believed there might be hidden feelings did not make it acceptable for her to pursue a man who kept telling her no. Motivation explained behavior. It did not erase responsibility. I opened the next screenshot. This one came from several days after our family meeting. Kayla. I know he said it clearly. I heard him. Denise. I know. Kayla. Maybe I really do need to leave it alone. Denise. Probably. For 1 second, I thought I had found the conversation where Mom finally did the right thing. Then Kayla wrote. It just didn't feel real with Danny sitting right there. Denise answered. That's the part I understand. Kayla. Do you think he would have said something different if she wasn't? There was almost a 20-minute gap before Mom's reply. I don't know. I felt my stomach tighten. Kayla, that's not helpful. Denise. I'm not trying to be helpful. I'm being honest. Kayla. I wish I could talk to him once without her there. Just once. Then if he says the same thing, I'll stop. That was the sentence I had been waiting for without realizing it. Not. I want to walk down Danny's aisle. Not, Dad should escort me toward Josh. Not. I want everyone at the wedding to watch me make one last confession. Kayla had asked for one private chance to talk to him. Still wrong. Still disrespectful. Still an attempt to go around a boundary Josh and I had set together. But it was not the plan that happened at the chapel. Mom's reply came several minutes later. You won't get him alone before the wedding. Danny will make sure of that. Kayla, then forget it. Denise. Maybe there is another way. I stopped scrolling. Josh leaned closer. There. I nodded. There it was. The exact point where the idea changed owners. Kayla had suggested violating our boundary privately. Denise had decided privacy was impractical and started looking for another route. The next screenshot had been taken later that night. Denise. Your father could walk you down first. Kayla. What? Denise. Not all the way. Just enough that Josh has to stop looking past everyone and look at you. Kayla. Mom, that's insane. I stared at those words. Kayla herself had called it insane. Denise continued. It's 30 seconds. Kayla. It's Danny's wedding. Denise. The ceremony won't have started yet. Kayla. She'll kill me. Denise. She'll be angry. Then she'll get married. You will finally have an answer you believe. Kayla did not reply for 6 minutes. Then she wrote, Dad would never do it. Mom answered, Let me handle your father. I put the phone flat on the table. For weeks, I had pictured Kayla approaching Mom with an elaborate plan. I had imagined my sister crying, insisting she needed one last chance, and my parents giving in. Even after Dad sent me the planning messages, some part of me still thought the original idea had been Kayla's, and Denise had simply turned it into logistics. That screenshot destroyed the red herring completely. My mother had invented the aisle. Kayla had wanted one private conversation she had no right to ask for. Denise had transformed that request into a public spectacle because she believed Josh could not avoid answering if Kayla appeared in front of him while I was physically separated from him. It was more calculated than I had understood. Not because Denise expected Josh to abandon me at the altar. The screenshots made that clear too. She believed the opposite. She believed he would say no again. The purpose was to manufacture a version of the rejection that Kayla would finally accept. My wedding became a controlled experiment. Remove Danny from Josh's immediate side. Put Kayla directly in his line of sight. Force an answer. Return Dad to me. Continue ceremony. 30 seconds. The simplicity of it was probably what allowed Mom to convince herself it was harmless. I opened the direct thread between Dad and Mom again. Now the messages took on a different meaning. You walk her a few steps. Josh sees her. She asks the question. He answers. Done. Mom had not been communicating Kayla's plan. She had been pitching her own. Dad's resistance was still there. We promised Danny. It'll humiliate her. That means I leave Danny standing there. Those objections proved he understood what Denise was proposing. His eventual agreement made him responsible. But they also proved something else. Mom had to persuade him because the idea was hers. I called Dad. He answered carefully. Hi. I saw the screenshot where Mom suggested the aisle. He said nothing. Did Kayla ever ask you to walk her down before Mom brought it up? No. Did she come up with the family photo excuse? No. Did she decide where it would happen? No. Did she ask you directly? No. I looked at Josh. So Mom planned it. Dad's voice was quiet. Yes. There was nothing satisfying about hearing him say it. I had wanted clarity, and clarity arrived without relief. Why didn't you tell me that before? I thought the texts showed it. They do now that I've seen everything. I wanted to hear you say it. Your mother came up with the logistics. Not the logistics, Dad. The event. He sighed. Kayla wanted to violate the boundary privately, I said. Mom decided my wedding was the place to make it happen publicly. Yes. And you still participated. Yes. I appreciated that he no longer tried to hide inside softer verbs. I asked one more question. Did Mom ever tell you she thought Josh might choose Kayla? No. Did you think that? No. Then neither of you believed there was some secret romantic outcome waiting at the altar. No. That answer mattered. They had not risked my wedding because they believed I was about to marry a man who secretly loved my sister. If that had been their sincere belief, the morality would still have been ugly, but the logic would have been different. They had done it because Mom believed Kayla was entitled to a form of rejection that satisfied her emotionally. That was the center of everything. I thanked Dad for answering and ended the call. Then I called Mom. I had not spoken to her directly since before the honeymoon. She answered so quickly that I wondered whether she had been waiting. Dani? Was the aisle your idea? No greeting. No warm-up. Silence. Then, it wasn't like that. I almost smiled. Not because anything was funny, but because I finally recognized the phrase for what it was. It wasn't like that did not mean I was wrong. It meant the facts were uncomfortable without her explanation around them. I have the screenshots. Her breathing changed. Your father gave you our private messages? He gave me the messages about a plan that involved me. That was between your father and me. It stopped being private when you used it to change my wedding. Donnie, you are seeing fragments. Was the aisle your idea? I was trying to help Kayla put an end to something that was destroying her. That's not an answer. It is the answer. No. It's your reason. I asked who came up with the plan. Mom exhaled sharply. Fine. I suggested it. The admission landed with less force than I expected, because I had already seen her words. But hearing her own, it removed the final space she could hide in. Why? I just told you. I wanted to help both of you. I laughed once. How did leaving me standing at my wedding help me? Because this was never going to end otherwise. It had ended. Josh said no. We had a meeting. Everyone agreed. Kayla did not believe him. That was Kayla's problem. She is your sister. And he is my husband. He wasn't your husband yet. The sentence came out so quickly that I think Mom regretted it before I even responded. I went quiet. She tried to repair it. That's not what I meant. What did you mean? I meant there was still time to settle everything before the marriage became official. I had thought I was past being shocked by her reasoning. I wasn't. Settle what? Whether Josh meant no? Whether Kayla could accept it? Those are not the same thing. I know that. No, Mom, you don't. Because every time she started accepting his answer, you gave her another interpretation. That isn't fair. I have your messages. You have selected screenshots from a girl who was crying to her mother. Exactly. And in those screenshots, she says things like, maybe I imagined it. And you tell her maybe she met him at the wrong time. She says, he keeps saying no. And you tell her that's what he has to say because I'm there. She says maybe she should let it go. And you tell her you don't know what he really feels. I was trying to keep her from feeling worthless. There it was. Not evil. Not hatred. Something much more recognizable. Mom could not stand watching Kayla feel rejected. So you lied to her. I never told her Josh loved her. You didn't need to. I told her repeatedly not to build her life around him. After telling her his no might not mean no, I said people are complicated. Josh wasn't. Mom went quiet. He was painfully simple, I continued. He told her the conversations were inappropriate. He told her no. He told her he loved me. He told her in front of all of us that he had never had romantic feelings for her. The complication came from you. Do you think I wanted any of this? I think you wanted Kayla to stop hurting. Yes. And you were willing to make everybody else responsible for getting her there. That's not true. It is exactly what happened. Mom's voice rose for the first time. You don't know what it was like watching her fall apart every night. No, I don't. She wasn't sleeping. She was barely eating. She kept saying she'd ruined everything. She thought you would never speak to her again. Then she needed help accepting what she'd done. I was helping her. You were helping her avoid the one thing she needed to accept. Mom went silent again. I remembered all the smaller disappointments from our childhood, all the external explanations, all the times Denise had found a reason why rejection was not really rejection. She probably believed she was protecting Kayla's self-esteem. Maybe for years the consequences had been small enough that nobody noticed the cost. This time, the cost had walked down my aisle. I was trying to save both my daughters, Mom finally said. No. My voice was calmer than hers now. You were trying to save Kayla from hearing no. That's cruel. It's accurate. You've always been able to move on from things. Kayla isn't like you. Then she needs to learn. You make everything sound so easy. I didn't say easy. You think because you're strong, everyone else should just be strong too. No. I think because she's an adult, everyone else should stop rearranging reality for her. Mom started crying. Years earlier, that would have ended the conversation. I would have softened my words, reassured her that I knew she meant well, then gone home, feeling as though I had somehow been responsible for making my mother upset. I did not do that anymore. I waited. After a while, she said, "Your father had no right to send you those messages without talking to me. That's what you're angry about? I'm angry that you're building a case against me from private conversations. You've been calling relatives for weeks telling them Josh encouraged Kayla because there is context. You cropped the context. I did not crop anything. You told Aunt Carol about coffee machine messages and left out the part where Josh told Kayla no. Because Carol wasn't asking for a transcript. Then why bring up messages at all?" Mom did not answer. I understood then that she still believed the problem was presentation. If she could get everyone into a room and explain how distraught Kayla had been, how complicated emotions were, how badly Denise had wanted peace, the facts would become less important. She still thought intention could negotiate with chronology. "I am not discussing this with relatives one at a time," I said. "Then stop sending people against me." "I haven't sent anyone. Your father is suddenly acting like everything was my fault. He can explain his own choices. And Kayla isn't speaking to me." That caught my attention. "What?" "She hasn't answered me since yesterday." I did not know that. I did not pretend I did. "Why?" "Because apparently your father told her he gave you the messages. And she says she needs space." I sat back. For the first time, Mom sounded less angry than frightened. Not frightened that I would cut her off. That possibility had existed since the wedding. Frightened that Kayla might. I could hear the emotional structure of their relationship cracking in real time. Denise had spent weeks telling herself she was protecting Kayla. If Kayla eventually saw those same messages as manipulation rather than rescue, Mom would lose the very role she had been trying to preserve. But that was between them. "I don't know what Kayla's going to do," I said. "You've turned her against me." "No, you showed her." "I haven't shown her anything." Mom stopped. That was important. At that point, I had not sent Kayla a single screenshot. Whatever distance Kayla was creating had begun before I intervened. "Then your father did," Mom said. "I don't know what Dad told her. Everyone has pieces of this now, and nobody is letting me explain. You've been explaining for 3 weeks. Not with everyone in the same room." I almost laughed. There it was. The same instinct again. If the current audience did not accept the explanation, create a new setting where the explanation might work better. Mom took a breath. "We need to sit down. All of us. You, Josh, Kayla, your father. Carol too, since she's been calling everyone. Emily. Anyone who's heard part of this? Everybody needs to hear both sides, instead of these little screenshots being passed around like I'm some kind of monster." I thought about saying no. Then I realized what she had just offered me. An audience of the exact people she had chosen to involve. Not social media. Not 90 wedding guests. Not half the city. A small circle of relatives who had received Denise's version and were now being asked by Denise herself to hear the evidence. Okay, I said. Mom sounded surprised. Okay? One meeting. Good. With conditions. Her tone changed immediately. Dani, no interruptions while someone is presenting something. If you say Josh encouraged Kayla, the full relevant thread gets shown, not selected screenshots. If you say the wedding plan was spontaneous, the planning text gets shown. If you say Dad didn't know, his messages get shown. If you say I set Kayla up for humiliation, we can watch the ceremony footage. Mom went quiet. You said everyone needs context, I continued. We'll give them context. I don't want this turning into a trial. Then don't make accusations you can't support. You're already treating me like I'm guilty. I'm treating the timeline like it happened. She did not answer for several seconds. Finally, she said, Fine. But I get to speak. Absolutely. And you don't cut me off. I won't. That was probably the part she expected me to resist. I wanted her to speak. I wanted her to tell the complete version she believed would save her before a single screenshot appeared. I wanted there to be no claim afterward that I had silenced her, twisted her words, or prevented anyone from understanding her intentions. We agreed on the following weekend. Dad would be there. Kayla would be invited, not forced. Josh would come because Mom's story involved him. Carol and Emily would come because Denise had already spoken to both of them directly. After we hung up, I told Josh what happened. He listened, then asked, Are you sure you want to do this? Yes. Because you don't owe anybody a presentation. I know. Then why agree? I thought about it. Because Mom is still telling people the problem is missing context. Josh nodded. And I want to see what happens when she has all the context she asked for and nowhere left to move the meaning. That evening, a group message arrived from Mom. She wrote that our family had been damaged by partial information, hurt feelings, and public assumptions, and that she wanted everyone to sit down calmly and hear both sides. She said no one should arrive intending to attack anyone. She said the goal was healing. Dad replied, I'll be there. Carol wrote, Okay. Emily agreed. Kayla did not answer. Almost an hour later, her name finally appeared beneath the message. I'll come. I stared at that reply for a moment, then set my phone down. Mom wanted an audience so she could give them context. For the first time in my life, I decided to give her exactly the audience she asked for. The meeting happened the following Saturday at Aunt Carol's house, because nobody wanted it at my parents' place, and I had already decided my condo was no longer available for family damage control. Josh came with me, but we agreed on the drive over that he would not argue with anyone unless somebody directly misrepresented what he had said or done. I was not bringing him there to defend me. I was bringing him because Mom had spent weeks using his name to support a story he had never told. Dad was already there when we arrived. He looked tired but sober, composed and uncomfortable in a way I had stopped feeling responsible for fixing. Carol and Emily were in the living room. Kayla sat by herself at the far end of the couch. Mom was beside the fireplace with a folder on her lap, which would have been almost funny if the situation had not been so serious. She had accused me of building a case against her, then arrived with one of her own. No one hugged. Carol offered coffee. Nobody wanted any. Mom began because the meeting had been her idea. She said she wanted everyone to remember that families were complicated, that people made mistakes when they were emotional, and that the events at my wedding had been reduced to one shocking moment without anyone considering the months of pain that led up to it. I did not interrupt. I had promised I wouldn't. She said Kayla had developed feelings she never intended to have. She said Josh had been kind to her in the beginning, which created confusion. She said Kayla tried repeatedly to move on but kept questioning whether she had misunderstood the situation. She said she had been terrified that my sister would carry that uncertainty into every future family gathering. Then she said the sentence I had been waiting for. We thought 30 seconds would give her closure. Dad looked at the floor. Mom continued. No one expected it to become a public confrontation. Josh threatened to expose Kayla in front of everyone. Danny read private family messages during the ceremony. Things escalated. I waited until she stopped. "Are you finished?" I asked. Her mouth tightened. "For now?" I opened the folder I had brought, although almost everything was also on my phone. "Then I want to start with one thing. Did Josh encourage Kayla romantically?" Mom crossed her arms. I said there were messages that made her confused. "That's not what I asked." She glanced at Carol. He responded to her. Josh spoke before I did. To normal family messages. Mom looked at him. "Which is what I said." "No," I said. "You told people those replies explained why Kayla believed there might be something between them." I handed Carol printed screenshots of the relevant portion of the full thread. Not months of messages, not every embarrassing thing Kayla had written. Just enough to show the sequence. Ordinary family exchange. Kayla comparing herself to me. Josh not responding. Kayla asking whether things would have been different if they met first. Josh saying no, and telling her the conversation was inappropriate. Kayla continuing. Josh stating clearly that he loved me and there was nothing between them. Carol read quietly, then passed the pages to Emily. Mom said, "Nobody is denying." He eventually said no. "Eventually?" Josh asked. She ignored him. I looked at Kayla. "Did Josh ever tell you he had romantic feelings for you?" Her face reddened. "No." "Did he ever ask you to wait for him?" "No." "Did he ever ask you to keep your conversations secret from me?" "No." "Did he ever tell you he was unhappy with me?" "No." Mom shifted. That doesn't mean Kayla invented every feeling she had. I never said she invented her feelings. I said Josh didn't return them. Nobody argued. I moved to the next point. Mom also told people Dad reacted to a family emergency and didn't understand what Kayla intended until they were already moving. Mom immediately said, "That is not exactly what I said." Emily looked at her. "That's basically what you told me." Mom's expression changed. I took out Dad's messages with Denise from the night before the wedding and handed them to Carol. I had removed unrelated portions. What remained was enough. "We promised Danny. She wants 30 seconds. That means I leave Danny standing there. For 30 seconds. You are asking me to break my word. Fine. 30 seconds. Then it's over." Dad did not ask me to stop. Carol looked up at him after reading. "You knew the night before?" "Yes," Mom said. He objected. I turned toward her. "That's true." He knew it was wrong. And did it anyway. Dad closed his eyes briefly. "That's true too." The room went silent. Mom looked betrayed by his answer. "Raymond, you were there. I know. You agreed. I know. Then stop acting like this was all me." Dad finally looked at her. "I haven't." That mattered because for once he was not trying to survive by disappearing between two sides. I said, "Dad is responsible for walking away from me. Kayla is responsible for walking down that aisle. You are responsible for creating the plan." Mom stared at me. "That's your interpretation." "No, that's your text." I handed Kayla the screenshot. She looked down. Her own words were there. I wish I could talk to him once without her there. Then Mom's answer. "Maybe there is another way. Your father could walk you down first." Kayla stopped reading. Mom leaned toward her. "You already know this." Kayla looked up slowly. "I knew you suggested it. I didn't remember how much I argued with you." Mom's face tightened. "You wanted to talk to him." "I did." "Then don't pretend I invented the whole problem." "I didn't say you did." I stayed out of it. For the first time, Kayla and Denise were speaking, without me serving as the object they were arguing around. Kayla looked back at the pages. "I called it insane." Mom said nothing. "I told you it was Danny's wedding. You still agreed to do it." "I know." Her voice cracked, but she continued. "I'm not saying I didn't. I'm saying I was already trying to back away. And you kept finding another reason I shouldn't." Mom's eyes flashed toward me. "Is this what you've been telling her?" "I haven't told her anything." Kayla looked at Mom. She didn't need to. I took out the final screenshots, the ones that mattered most to the deeper pattern. and placed them on the coffee table. Maybe I imagined the whole thing. Or maybe you met someone at the wrong time. He keeps saying no in every way that matters. Or maybe he's saying what he has to say because Danielle is standing beside him. Kayla read them without touching the pages. Her face changed gradually, not surprise. Recognition. I remember this one, she said. Mom's voice softened. Honey, you were falling apart. Kayla nodded once. I was trying to help you. I know. Mom visibly relaxed. Then Kayla continued. But every time I tried to accept that he didn't want me, you gave me another reason not to. Denise stared at her. I was protecting you. From what? Mom did not answer. Kayla's voice became steadier. From hearing no? From feeling like you were worthless. Those aren't the same thing. That sentence sounded almost strange coming from Kayla. Not because she was incapable of understanding it, but because our family had spent years teaching her the opposite. Mom started crying. I did everything because I love you. Kayla looked miserable, but she did not move toward her. I know you love me, she said. You also made this worse. Mom turned immediately toward me. This is what you wanted. No, you wanted everyone to blame me. I wanted you to stop telling people my husband encouraged my sister. You brought all of this here. You asked for everyone to hear both sides. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Carol finally spoke. Denise, you told me this was a misunderstanding. It was. Carol shook her head. No. A misunderstanding is when people don't know what they're agreeing to. Those texts literally say, "We promised Danny." Emily nodded. And you planned the picture excuse. Mom looked around the room as though she had only just realized the audience she requested was no longer functioning the way she expected. This is unbelievable, she said. Everyone is ignoring why I did it. I answered calmly. No one is confused about why you did it. You couldn't stand watching Kayla hurt. The problem is that you decided her pain gave you permission to violate somebody else's boundary. Dad rubbed his hands together. She's right. Mom turned on him. Now, you're taking her side? He shook his head. I should have taken her side the night before the wedding. That was probably the first thing Dad said all afternoon that cost him something. Mom stood up. I am not staying here while all of you turn me into some monster. I did not stop her. Kayla did. Mom. Denise looked at her. I need space from you. Mom's face emptied. What? I don't know how much of what I believed was mine and how much you kept feeding because you thought you were helping me. Kayla, don't do this. I have to. Mom looked at me again, desperate now. You see what you've done? I stood. No. She read your words. Mom left without saying goodbye. Dad did not follow her. That surprised everyone, including him. Kayla stayed seated, staring at the papers on the table. After a while, she looked at Josh. I owe you an apology. He waited. I kept treating your answer like it was a puzzle instead of an answer. That was wrong. Josh nodded. Yes. She flinched, but he did not soften it for her. Then she looked at me. Mom encouraged me. But she didn't send those messages. I did. Yes. And she didn't make me walk down the aisle. No. I did that too. I nodded. Kayla wiped her face. I'm sorry. I believed she meant it. That did not mean I trusted her. I hear you, I said. I'm not ready to do anything with that yet. She nodded. For once, she did not ask for more. When Josh and I left, nobody clapped, nobody declared me the winner, and I did not need them to. Mom had asked for a room where everyone could hear her context. She got one. The context did not erase what she had done. It only showed how deliberately she had done it. On the drive home, Josh asked if I felt better. I thought about it before answering. No. But I feel finished explaining. That was enough. The weeks after the family meeting were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, exactly, but quiet in the way a house becomes quiet after something finally breaks, and everyone stops pretending it is still intact. Mom did not call me for almost a month. Dad contacted me only twice, both times by text, and neither message asked me to forgive anyone or reconsider the distance I had created. Kayla disappeared from the family group chats altogether. For the first time since Josh put his phone in front of me, there was no new crisis waiting every morning. I went to work, came home to my husband, made dinner, answered emails, and slowly remembered that most of my life had nothing to do with my sister's feelings. Dad was the first person who did something that mattered without asking me to notice. Aunt Carol mentioned it casually one afternoon. He had called her and told her that the version Mom had been spreading was wrong. He said Josh had never encouraged Kayla romantically, that we had held a family meeting 3 weeks before the wedding, and that he had personally promised nothing would interfere with walking me down the aisle. Then he told Carol the part that cost him the most. He had known about Denise's plan the night before the wedding, had argued against it, understood it was wrong, and agreed anyway. He called Emily afterward, then 2 other relatives Mom had contacted. He did not blame Denise. He did not say he had been pressured beyond his control. He said, "I knew what I was doing. I thought avoiding a bigger fight justified breaking my word. It didn't. I never asked him to make those calls. That was why they mattered." For years, Dad's version of keeping peace had been to let other people tell whatever story kept the room calmest. This time he corrected a lie, even though doing so made him look worse. A week later, he asked if I would meet him for coffee. I agreed, but chose a cafe instead of my condo or my parents' house. I did not want another conversation where family history became an excuse to stay 3 hours longer than I intended. Dad looked older than he had on my wedding morning. He apologized before I had even taken my coat off. There was no but after it. No explanation about how devastated Kayla had been. No reminder that Mom could be persuasive when she believed she was helping someone. He simply said, "I left you standing at the entrance to your own wedding after promising you I wouldn't. I knew it would hurt you. I did it because I wanted 30 seconds of quiet from a problem I was too cowardly to confront properly." I sat across from him and let the sentence remain ugly. I did not tell him he had made a mistake because that word had become too small. He had made a decision. He had hours to reverse it. He had driven to the chapel, hugged me, taken pictures with me, stood beside me, and still followed through. "I know you're sorry," I said. "I believe that." Dad nodded, his eyes already wet. I continued. "But being sorry now doesn't restore the relationship we had before you did it. I know. I don't want Mom's messages passed through you. I don't want you asking me to reconcile because Thanksgiving is uncomfortable. I don't want to hear that Kayla is doing better and therefore I should give her another chance. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be about you and me. Okay. And if you ever know someone is planning to violate a boundary I've clearly set, neutrality isn't an option." He looked down at his coffee. "I understand that now." I almost told him understanding it now was the easy part. Instead, I let him live with what he had already said. Dad did not need another lecture from me. He needed time in which his actions either matched his apology or did not. I told him I was not cutting him out of my life, but rebuilding would be slow and there would be no schedule for forgiveness. He accepted that without bargaining. It was the first conversation I could remember where my father left without trying to make sure everyone felt better before the subject was closed. Kayla surprised me in a different way. 3 weeks after the family meeting, she sent me a message. It was long enough that I almost saved it for later, but the first line stopped me. "I'm not asking you to forgive me." She said she had started seeing a therapist and had stopped discussing me, Josh, and the wedding with Mom. She admitted she had spent years believing strong feelings deserved answers, explanations, exceptions, something more than a simple refusal. She said hearing Josh's no had hurt, but instead of accepting that hurt, she had searched for a version of events where the answer might change. Then she wrote something I had not expected from her. Mom encouraged me, but she didn't send those messages. She didn't ask Josh whether things would have been different if he met me first. She didn't walk down your aisle. I did those things. I let her give me excuses because I wanted them. That was the first apology from Kayla that did not contain a request hidden inside it. I read the message twice before answering. I could have told her I was proud of her. I could have said we would work things out eventually. Neither would have been honest. Instead, I wrote, "That's a better place to start. I hope you keep doing the work." She responded with a heart and nothing else. We were not suddenly sisters again. I did not invite her over for dinner. Josh did not unblock her. She was not folded back into our marriage because she had discovered the correct language for accountability. Trust was something she had broken through repeated choices, and it would take more than insight to rebuild it. But I also stopped needing her to suffer forever. If Kayla learned to hear no without turning it into a challenge, that was good for her. It just did not obligate me to stand close enough to supervise the lesson. The person who struggled most with the new arrangement was Mom. Kayla had reduced contact with her. Dad had stopped supporting her version of the wedding. Relatives who once called me with questions stopped doing it after the family meeting. Denise had spent weeks trying to control the story, and when the story finally stood on its own, she had nowhere useful to push it. She called me in late July. I nearly let it go to voicemail, but answered because I wanted to know whether anything had changed. For the first few minutes, she asked about work and whether Josh and I had finished organizing wedding gifts. Then her voice shifted. Your sister barely talks to me anymore. I know she's taking some space. And your father acts like I'm the only person who did anything wrong. He admitted what he did. He keeps correcting people as if I went around spreading lies. You told people Josh encouraged Kayla. There were messages. There were full messages. You used pieces of them. Mom sighed. We're never going to agree about that. No, Mom. This isn't an opinion difference. That frustrated her enough that the real grievance finally came out. Do you know how people look at me now? Carol barely speaks to me. Emily stopped inviting me for coffee. Kayla says I made her worse. Your father walks around this house like he's ashamed to be married to me. You got what you wanted. Everyone thinks I'm some kind of monster. I stood in my kitchen looking at the dining table where Josh had handed me his phone months earlier. For the first time, I understood how much of my life had been spent quietly absorbing consequences so someone else would not have to feel them. If Mom hurt Kayla, I was supposed to help restore peace. If Kayla hurt me, I was expected to consider her pain before my own. If Dad chose silence, I was supposed to accept that he hated conflict. Their reputations had survived, partly because I had always participated in the repair. Not anymore. I never asked anyone to think anything about you. You showed them those messages. After you told them your version, you knew what would happen. Yes. She went quiet. I didn't ruin your reputation, Mom. I stopped protecting it. Her breathing changed. Then she started crying. I did not apologize. I also did not hang up. I stayed on the phone while she cried because compassion and surrender were not the same thing. Eventually she asked, Do you even love me anymore? I do. Then how can you treat me like this? Because loving you and giving you access to me are not the same thing. I was trying to protect my daughter. You had 2 daughters. The silence after that was different. I continued before she could turn it into another argument. Kayla was hurting, and you decided that meant everyone else had to move. Josh had to repeat himself. Dad had to break his promise. I had to stand at my wedding and wait while you created one more chance for her to hear an answer she'd already been given. You keep asking everyone to understand why you did it. We understand. That doesn't make it acceptable. Mom told me I sounded cruel. Maybe once that would have made me defend myself. I did not bother. I hope you get help understanding why somebody else's pain feels like an emergency you have to solve, I said. But I'm not going to be part of solving it for you. That was the last real conversation we had before I went low contact. By August, Josh and I had been married a little over 2 months. Most days were beautifully ordinary. We worked, we argued about takeout. We replaced a broken shelf in the condo and discovered that neither of us was as good at assembling furniture as we had claimed. We started talking about a longer trip for the following year. Nobody whispered Kayla's name every night. Nobody checked phones for secret messages. Our marriage did not become more dramatic after the wedding. It became quieter, which was exactly what I wanted. Then our wedding album arrived. Josh opened the box while I cleared dinner dishes. We sat together on the couch and went through it page by page. The photographer had captured things I barely remembered. Dad laughing with one of Josh's friends before the ceremony, Mom adjusting my veil, Kayla talking to an aunt before everything went wrong, Josh looking nervous at the altar. For a moment, seeing those pictures reminded me that people were rarely only one thing. Dad had loved me that morning and betrayed me later. Mom had looked at me in my dress and sincerely thought I was beautiful, then used my wedding to manage Kayla's emotions. Love had existed beside the harm. It just had not prevented it. Then I turned the page. The photograph showed me standing alone at the entrance to the chapel. Dad had already moved out of the frame. Mom and Kayla were gone. I was holding my bouquet too tightly, and the aisle stretched in front of me toward Josh. I remembered the coordinator asking if I wanted someone else to walk beside me. I remembered saying no. Josh studied the picture with me. "We don't have to keep that one in the album," he said. For weeks after the wedding, I had imagined that photograph would represent everything I lost. A father at my side. A mother I trusted. A sister who understood the difference between desire and entitlement. The family image I had expected to carry into marriage had fractured before I took my first step down the aisle. But looking at the picture months later, loss was not the first thing I saw. I saw myself still standing. I remembered Dad sitting down. I remembered the music restarting. I remembered putting one foot in front of the other while everyone watched. Then, I remembered reaching Josh. "No," I said. "Keep it." He looked at me. "You sure?" "Yeah." I touched the edge of the photograph. For most of my life, I had believed strength meant being able to handle everything myself. Josh had taught me something better before we were even married. Strength also meant knowing who could be trusted enough to stand beside you. My family taught me the other half. When someone repeatedly proves they cannot respect your boundaries, wisdom is not finding a better explanation. Sometimes wisdom is removing their access. Dad had left my side, and I still walked. Mom had tried to rewrite the truth, and I stopped protecting the rewrite. Kayla had wanted an answer she could accept, and eventually she had to learn that another person's no did not belong to her. None of them lost because I destroyed them. They lost the roles they had taken for granted, because their own choices made those roles impossible to keep. I looked at the photograph one last time, then turned the page. You can care about someone and still refuse to let their feelings override your boundaries. A clear no should not become maybe, just because someone is hurt, and an apology means little without accountability and changed behavior. You do not have to protect people from consequences they knowingly created. Trust actions more than promises. Choose partners who tell you the truth, and remember that forgiveness does not require restoring access. If this story reminded you to protect your peace without losing your compassion, subscribe to the channel for more stories about family, boundaries, consequences, and choosing yourself wisely.